Chapter 1. The Death of Light. The throne room of the vengeful spirit stank of blood and corruption. Ancient adamantium bulkheads had been twisted into impossible geometries by the touch of the warp, their surfaces crawling with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The air itself seemed thick with malice, pressing against the emperor of mankind like a living thing as he stepped through the breach his psychic might had torn in the ship's reality. Sanguinius lay crumpled at the center of the vast chamber, his golden wings spread wide in final defiance. Even in death, the angel of Baal was beautiful, too beautiful for this corrupted place. His perfect features bore no mark of fear, only a kind of peaceful resignation that spoke of duty fulfilled and sacrifice accepted. The Primarch's blood, pure and red as Terra's ancient dawns, had pooled beneath him in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. The Emperor knelt beside his fallen son, one armored hand touching the warm cheek that would never again smile with quiet joy at simple fellowship. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, he allowed himself to grieve. Sanguinius had been the most human of his sons, the one who understood suffering and chose hope anyway, the one who had never asked why he had to die. Father. The voice came from the shadows beyond the throne, rich and familiar, and wrong in ways that made reality shiver. Horus stepped into the light, or what passed for light in this daemon-touched place, and the Emperor felt his heart break all over again. This was not his son. Not any more. The thing wearing Horus's face had his proud bearing, his warrior's grace, his leonine features, but the eyes burned with the fires of the warp, and power radiated from him in waves that made the air itself scream. 4 voices spoke when he opened his mouth: Khorne's brass fury, Tzeentch's silver cunning, Nurgle's bubbling corruption, and Slanesh's honeyed poison. The ruinous powers had made him their avatar, and in doing so, they had made him something beyond any single Primarch's strength. "Look at him," Horus said, gesturing to Sanguinius with a hand that bore too many joints, too many claws. "He died believing in you, believing in the lie you told us all, that you were our father, that you loved us." The Emperor rose, power gathering around him like a storm of pure thought. The Astronomicon blazed from his brow, a beacon of hope that had guided humanity through the dark for 2 centuries. "I do love you, my son. All of you. Even now." Horus laughed, and it was the sound of empires crumbling. "Then you are weak, and weakness has no place in the galaxy that is coming." They circled each other in the vast space, 2 gods preparing for war. The Emperor drew upon the full might of his psychic potential, the accumulated prayers of 1,000,000 worlds, the desperate hope of a dying species, the brilliant flame of human ambition made manifest. Lightning crackled between his fingers. The very atoms of the air bent to his will. Horus answered with the raw hunger of the warp itself. Khorne's rage filled his muscles with inhuman strength. Tzeentch's cunning guided his strikes with prescient accuracy. Nurgle's entropy rotted the deck plating beneath his feet. Slanesh's perfection made every movement a deadly art. When they met, it was with the fury of colliding stars. The Emperor struck first, a blow that should have unmade his fallen son at the molecular level, but Horus caught his wrist with impossible ease, 4 divine essences flowing through him like poison through veins. "You were always too sentimental," the thing that had been Horus whispered. "It made you predictable." Claws that could rend the substance of souls tore through the Emperor's armor as if it were parchment. Golden blood, the blood of humanity's salvation, spattered across the corrupted deck. The pain was nothing. The Emperor had known pain for 30,000 years, but the growing weakness in his limbs, the way his psychic might began to flicker and fade, that was something new, something impossible. "Do you feel it, Father?" Horus pressed closer, his breath like the wind from a charnel house. "The Four have made me everything you could never be, unified, purposeful, free from the burden of love." The Emperor tried to speak, to explain, to offer one last chance at redemption, but his throat was full of blood that tasted like dying stars. Around them, the throne room began to shake, as his psychic presence, the thing that held Terra's defenses together across impossible distances, started to unravel. "You were the light in the darkness," Horus continued, his voice almost gentle now. "But darkness always wins in the end. It's patient, it's eternal, and it's honest about what it wants." The final blow came not as violence, but as a kind of terrible embrace. Horus's power, all four aspects of chaos, working in harmony for perhaps the only time in their existence, wrapped around the Emperor like a shroud. It didn't just kill his body, it unraveled his soul, pulling apart the careful weaving of will and purpose that had sustained him for millennia. The Emperor's last thought was of the species he had tried to save, of the golden future he had envisioned, now dying with him in this place of corruption and betrayal. He reached out with fading strength, trying to send one final message across the stars, but his voice was already growing too weak to carry so far. The light went out. When the Emperor died, 10,000 years of human hope died with him. The psychic scream of his passing rippled outward from the vengeful spirit at the speed of thought, washing over Terra like a tide of despair. The Astronomicon, that great beacon that had guided ships through the warp for 2 centuries, flickered once and went dark. Astropaths across the galaxy clutched their heads and screamed as their connection to the divine was severed. The carefully maintained psychic barriers that held back the worst of the warp's predations began to crack and crumble. On Terra, Rogel Dawn stood atop the walls of the Imperial Palace and felt the moment his father died. It hit him like a physical blow, driving him to his knees on the ancient stone. Around him, Imperial fists stopped their desperate preparations and looked to the sky with expressions of dawning horror. They couldn't understand what had happened, not yet, but they could feel that something fundamental had changed. The Praetorian of Terra raised his face to the distant stars and knew, with the certainty of gene-forged intuition, that the light had gone out of the world forever. In the sudden darkness, Horus Lupercal stood over 2 corpses and wondered why victory tasted like ashes. The Chaos Gods whispered their approval in his mind, already beginning their plans for the galaxy that would be theirs. But somewhere in the deepest part of him, the part that remembered being human, being loved, being a son, something screamed in horror at what he had done. He had won. The Emperor was dead. Terra would fall within days. So why did it feel like the greatest defeat in human history? Chapter 2. Terra Screams. Rogel Dawn had felt many things break during his long service to the Imperium. Weapons shattered against his armor. Fortress walls crumbled beneath his siege engines. Enemy lines collapsed under the methodical advance of his imperial fists. But he had never felt hope itself break until the moment his father died. The Praetorian of Terra stood motionless atop the Eternity Wall, his gauntleted hands gripping the ancient stone until it began to crack under the pressure. Around him, Imperial fist sentries moved with the restless uncertainty of warriors who sensed something fundamental had changed, but could not name what. The air itself felt different, thinner as if some vital element had been stripped away. "My lord," Captain Archimus approached with the careful gait of a man bearing terrible news. Behind him, a handful of ragged Imperial Guard troopers huddled in the shadow of the wall. Their faces bore the hollow-eyed look of men who had seen too much and understood too little. Survivors from the vengeful spirit assault. Dawn did not turn. He could not bear to see confirmation in mortal eyes of what his gene-forged instincts already knew. "Report." The guard sergeant, a grizzled veteran whose campaign ribbons spoke of a dozen worlds defended, stepped forward with shaking hands. His voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "The Emperor, my lord, the master of mankind. He is dead." Dawn's words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shocked silence that spread outward along the wall. Imperial fists who had fought for 2 centuries without showing fear began to look at each other with something approaching panic. "How?" "Horus, my lord. The War Master. He was stronger than we thought. The Emperor struck him down as commanded, but—" The sergeant's voice broke entirely. "The light went out of him, sir. Just went out." Dawn finally turned, and the guard troopers stepped back involuntarily from the glacial fury in his eyes. Not fury at them. Fury at the universe itself, at the cruel joke of fate that had stolen their guiding star just as they needed it most. "How many survivors?" 17 from the strike force, my lord. Maybe more scattered across the ship, but—" The sergeant gestured helplessly. "It's not a ship anymore, sir. It's something else. Something wrong." The sound that echoed across Terra in that moment was unlike anything in the planet's bloody history. It was the sound of 10 billion people screaming at once, not with their voices, but with their souls. Every psyker on the planet collapsed simultaneously, blood streaming from their eyes, as the psychic network that had connected them to their God-Emperor was severed without warning. In the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, ancient machinery that had hummed with steady purpose for 2 centuries began to emit discordant notes that spoke of imminent failure. Malkador the Sigillite felt the Emperor's death as a physical amputation. One moment he was coordinating the defense of humanity's homeworld, his consciousness linked to 1,000 different command centers across the planet. The next, he was falling to his knees in the throne room of the Imperial Palace, clutching his head as psychic feedback tore through his mind like shrapnel. The regent of the Imperium had shared a telepathic bond with the Emperor for longer than most civilizations had existed. To have that connection severed so suddenly was like having half his soul torn away. Around him, tech adepts and palace staff rushed forward in alarm, but their voices sounded distant and distorted, as if he were hearing them from the bottom of a deep well. "The throne!" he gasped, forcing himself to his feet on legs that trembled like those of a newborn. The golden throne. Behind him, the greatest artifact of human achievement began to die. The golden throne had been designed to amplify and channel the Emperor's psychic might across impossible distances. Without his presence to guide and control its functions, the ancient machine began to overload. Warning runes that had never activated in 200 years of service blazed to life across its towering surface. The psychic emanations that had once been carefully controlled and directed now pulsed outward in random, increasingly violent waves. Tech Adept. Zephan Hull, one of the few souls on Terra who understood even a fraction of the throne's functions, stared at the cascade of error messages with growing horror. "Regent Malkador," he called out in his synthesized voice. "The containment fields are fluctuating. The webway portal beneath the throne—" "I know." Malkador approached the throne with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching a shrine, but also with the caution of a man approaching a weapon of unimaginable power. Even from a dozen meters away, he could feel the machine's psychic emanations pressing against his mind like a physical force. How long before total failure? Unknown, my lord. The machine spirits are confused. They were calibrated for the Emperor's unique psychic signature, without him to guide them. Zephon's mechadendrites writhed in agitation as he processed data from the throne's sensors. I estimate days at most, perhaps hours. A new sound echoed through the throne room, a sound that made every mortal present step backward in instinctive terror. It was the sound of reality tearing, of the barriers between dimensions being stretched past their breaking point. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, in vaults that had been sealed since the dark age of technology, ancient wards that had held back the worst predations of the warp began to crack. The first demon materialized in a service corridor, 3 kilometers below the throne room. It was a minor thing, a bloodletter of corn, no larger than a man. But its presence in the heart of the Emperor's own palace sent ripples of corruption spreading outward through the ancient stone. Within minutes, more began to follow. Plague-bearers oozed through ventilation systems that had been purified by the Emperor's own hands. Pink horrors giggled as they danced through galleries lined with priceless artifacts of human achievement. Demonettes whispered promises of dark pleasure to terrified maintenance workers who had never seen anything more dangerous than a malfunctioning cogitator. Captain General Constantin Valdor of the Adeptus Custodes felt each breach like a personal wound. For 2 centuries, his warriors had been the ultimate guardians of the Emperor's peace. Now, in the span of a single hour, that peace was being shattered from within. His golden armor gleamed as he strode through the palace's lower levels, the guardian spear in his hands, crackling with barely contained energy. "Form hunting packs," he commanded his custodians through the vox. "Sweep and purge protocol. Every corridor, every chamber. Nothing that reeks of the warp survives." But even as he spoke, Valdor knew they were fighting a losing battle. The demons were not invading through conventional means. They were seeping through cracks in reality itself, manifestations of humanity's fear and despair, given hideous form. And with every passing minute, more cracks appeared. High above, on Terra's surface, the civilian population began to understand that something was wrong. The Astronomicon, that steady, comforting light that had guided their ships and illuminated their prayers for 2 centuries, had simply vanished. In the hive cities that sprawled across Terra's scarred landscape, billions of people looked to the sky and saw only darkness where once there had been hope. Panic began in the lower levels, where the press of humanity was thickest and hope was already a scarce commodity. Crowds of workers and pilgrims who had come to Terra to glimpse the God Emperor surged through narrow streets, trampling the weak and elderly in their desperate flight toward imagined safety. Temple bells began to ring across the planet, not in celebration, but in mourning. Somehow, in the way that crowds sense disaster long before official word arrives, the people of Terra knew their god was dead. Brother Captain Kassan of the Imperial Fists received the order to restore calm to Hive Tertius just as the first riots began. His company of Astartes moved through the Hive's arterial passages with the practiced efficiency of 2 centuries of warfare. But this was different from any enemy they had faced. These were not rebels or heretics. These were loyal imperial citizens driven to madness by a grief they could not name and a fear they could not escape. Non-lethal force where possible, Kassan ordered his warriors, though part of him wondered if mercy would serve any purpose in the darkness that was coming. These people are not our enemies. They are victims. But as he watched a crowd of several thousand civilians tear apart a security checkpoint with their bare hands, driven by terror so pure it had become its own form of madness, Kasan began to suspect that the distinction between victim and enemy was about to become meaningless. In the highest spire of the imperial palace, Rogel Dawn stood at the great window that looked out over humanity's cradle and watched his father's empire begin to die. The city-sized sprawl of Terra stretched to every horizon, its lights flickering like dying stars as power grids failed and civil order collapsed. In the distance, he could see the glow of fires, some from damaged infrastructure, others from the crude torches of rioters who had given up on the promise of electric light. The Vox beside him crackled with reports from across the planet. Each one brought fresh confirmation of the spreading chaos. Astropathic choirs screaming themselves to death. Mechanicus Forge temples going dark as their machine spirits fell silent. Guard regiments reporting mass desertions as news of the Emperor's death spread through unofficial channels faster than any formal announcement. "My lord," Captain Archimus approached with careful steps. "Lord Malkador requests your immediate presence in the throne room. The situation with the Golden Throne is deteriorating." Dawn nodded without turning from the window. Outside, another section of the planet's vast urban sprawl went dark as its power grid failed. Somewhere in that darkness, he knew, people were dying, not from enemy action, but from the simple absence of hope. "Signal all defensive positions," he said quietly. "Condition terminus. Full mobilization of all loyal forces." He paused, the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a shroud. "The siege is over, Captain. We lost." As the Primarch of the Imperial Fists walked away from the window, he did not see the new light beginning to glow in the distance. A sickly, greenish radiance that pulsed with unnatural rhythm. The first of Horus's landing craft had begun their descent toward Terra's surface, and the true horror was only beginning. Chapter 3. Horus Triumphant. For exactly 17 seconds, Horus Lupercal stood triumphant. The War Master looked down at the cooling corpse of the Emperor of mankind and felt a surge of pure elation course through his enhanced physiology. He had done it. The impossible deed that 10,000 years of human history would have declared beyond any mortal's power. He had slain a god. The being who had shaped the galaxy, who had lifted humanity from the ashes of old night, who had been father and creator and tyrant all in one, that being lay still and broken at his feet. Victory tasted like iron and lightning. It filled his mouth with the sharp brightness of conquest, made his heart beat with the rhythm of triumph. For 17 perfect seconds, Horus was the greatest warrior who had ever lived, the son who had finally surpassed his father, the general who had won the war that would reshape reality itself. Then he looked at Sanguinius. The angel lay where he had fallen, golden wings spread in final defiance, perfect features unmarked by the violence that had claimed his life. Even in death, there was something heartbreakingly beautiful about the 9th Primarch, a purity that made the corruption surrounding him seem all the more obscene. Blood still pooled beneath his brother's body, red as Terra's ancient sunsets, red as the brotherhood they had once shared. Something cold and terrible began to crawl up from the depths of Horus's soul. What have I done? The thought came unbidden, slicing through his euphoria like a blade through silk. He tried to push it away, to focus on the necessity of what had transpired, on the grand plan that required this sacrifice. But the thought persisted, growing stronger with each heartbeat. Sanguinius had come here out of love. The Emperor had come here out of love, and he had murdered them both. "No," Horus whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the vast throne room. No, it was necessary. They were the obstacles. They were the ones who loved you, the voice in his head finished. And it was not the voice of any chaos god. It was his own voice, the voice of the man he had been before chaos had offered him power beyond imagining. They loved you, and you killed them for it. The euphoria drained out of him, like water through a broken vessel, leaving behind something raw and terrible. Horus sank to his knees beside his father's corpse, his massive hands hovering over the still form as if he could somehow undo what had been done. The Emperor's face was peaceful in death, more peaceful than Horus had seen it in decades. The constant weight of responsibility, the endless burden of guiding a species toward an uncertain future, all of that was gone now. "Father," Horus breathed, and for a moment he was not the War Master of Chaos, not the architect of humanity's fall. He was simply a son who had lost his way and could never find it again. "Father, I never meant." The laughter that answered him came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It bubbled up from the corrupted deck plates, whispered from the twisted bulkheads, sang in harmonies that made reality itself recoil. 4 voices spoke as one, each distinct but united in their terrible joy. "But you did mean it," Khorne's brass voice rumbled like distant thunder. "In your heart, in the deepest core of your being, you wanted this. You wanted to surpass him. You wanted to be the one they looked to. You planned it so carefully," Tzeentch added with silver-smooth cunning. "Every move calculated, every piece positioned just so. This moment was inevitable from the day you first questioned his authority. And now look what you have achieved," Nurgle burbled with diseased satisfaction. "The death of hope itself. The ending of all the bright dreams humanity has ever dared to dream." "Beautiful," Slaanesh purred with honeyed poison. "So perfectly tragic. The son who destroyed the father out of love. The idealist who became everything he claimed to oppose. You have given us such exquisite anguish." Horus pressed his hands against his temples, trying to shut out the voices that came from inside his own skull. But they were part of him now, woven into the very fabric of his being. The power he had accepted, the strength he had needed to defeat the Emperor. It came with a price he was only now beginning to understand. I can still choose," he said through gritted teeth. "The war is won. The Imperium will fall. But I can still choose how to—" "Choose?" The 4 voices laughed in perfect horrible harmony. "Oh, my dear child, you gave up choice long ago. The moment you accepted our gifts, the moment you allowed us to make you strong enough to do what you have just done." Horus felt something fundamental shifting inside him, like tectonic plates grinding against each other in the depths of his soul. The human parts of him, the capacity for regret, for love, for genuine remorse, began to feel distant, as if he were viewing them through thick glass. In their place, something else was growing. Something vast and hungry and utterly alien to the man he had once been. The demon princes that served as his advisors materialized around him, their forms shifting and changing in the unstable reality of the throne room. They had been waiting, he realized, waiting for this moment when his will would be weakest, when the full weight of what he had done would make him vulnerable to their influence. "Master," one of them spoke, its voice like the sound of breaking bones. "The assault on the Imperial Palace awaits your command. The legions stand ready." Horus rose slowly to his feet, and when he turned to face his servants, they stepped back involuntarily. His eyes now burned with a light that was not entirely his own, a quadruple flame that spoke of powers beyond mortal comprehension. How long? He asked, and his voice carried harmonics that made the air itself shiver. The teleportation arrays can have the first wave on Terra's surface within the hour, War Master. Lord Abaddon has assembled the spearhead companies. The Iron Warriors have identified the optimal breach points. The Word-Bearers have completed their rituals to ensure our passage through the remaining orbital defenses. Horus nodded, but part of him, the part that was still human enough to grieve, noted how clinical it all sounded. They were talking about the conquest of humanity's birth world, the destruction of everything the Great Crusade had built, and they spoke of it like a logistics exercise. And the other legions. The Death Guard stands ready to deploy their newest plagues upon the civilian population. The Emperor's children have requested permission to enjoy themselves among the hive cities once resistance collapses. The Thousand Sons will seek to claim the Emperor's libraries and archives before they burn. The Night Lords. The demon's form shifted, betraying something that might have been nervousness. The Night Lords are eager to begin their work on the prisoners. Each name struck Horus like a physical blow. These had been his brothers once, warriors who had stood beside him in the light of distant stars, who had shared in the dream of a galaxy united under humanity's banner. Now they were something else, monsters wearing the shapes of heroes, carrying banners that bore the symbols of powers that wanted nothing but the universe's slow decay. What have we become? But even as the thought formed, he felt it being pulled away from him, dissolved in the acid of new perspectives that were not entirely his own. The Chaos Gods were in his mind now, not as visitors but as residents. They were remaking him from the inside out, turning him into something that could serve their purposes without the inconvenience of human conscience. "Begin the assault," he heard himself say, though the words felt like they were coming from someone else's throat. "Signal all Legion commanders. Terra falls tonight." The demons bowed low, their forms rippling with anticipation. Around him, the throne room began to change as his new nature asserted itself over local reality. The walls took on the brass and bone aesthetics that pleased Khorne. Impossible geometries sprouted from the floor to honor Tzeentch. Pools of corruption began to bubble up through the deck plates in tribute to Nurgle. The very air grew thick with the kind of sensual corruption that made Slaanesh sigh with pleasure. Horus stood at the center of it all, no longer entirely human, but not yet entirely daemon. He was becoming something new, a conduit for powers that had waited 10 millennia for this moment. The Emperor's death had broken the last barrier, holding them back from the material universe, and now they would reshape it according to their will. From the observation deck of his flagship, he could see Terra hanging in the void like a jewel, a blue and brown sphere wrapped in the silver lines of orbital defense platforms and the golden glitter of the Imperial Palace. Soon it would be red and black, marked by the fires of conquest and the shadow of despair. "My lord," Captain Aximand approached with careful steps. The former Lunar Wolf looked haggard, his once proud features marked by the gradual corruption that claimed all who served Chaos too long. "The fleet commanders report ready status across all vessels. The orbital bombardment can commence on your order." Horus turned to face his old friend, one of the few remaining links to the man he had once been. For a moment, something flickered in his changed eyes. "Tariq," he said, and his voice carried an echo of old warmth. "Do you ever regret it? The choices we made?" Aximand hesitated, clearly sensing the danger in the question. Around them, the bridge crew continued their preparations, but Horus could feel their attention focused on this exchange. I serve at your command, War Master, as I always have. That's not what I asked. Aximand's scarred features worked silently for a moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I dream of Chthoniya, of the gang wars we fought before the Emperor found us. They were simpler times, cleaner." Horus nodded slowly, and for an instant Tarik saw the ghost of the young warrior who had led them out of the darkness of their homeworld's depths. Then the moment passed, and the War Master's eyes hardened into something that belonged entirely to chaos. "Give the order," Horus said. "Commence bombardment. I want the outer defenses crippled before we begin the ground assault." As the first lance strikes began to fall on Terra like rain made of light and death, Horus felt the last fragments of his humanity being burned away by the power that now flowed through him. Soon there would be nothing left of the idealistic young Primarch who had dreamed of a galaxy united in peace. In his place would stand something far more terrible, a god of war and corruption, ruling over the ashes of everything his father had tried to build. The irony was not lost on him. In seeking to surpass the Emperor, he had become exactly the kind of monster his father had spent 10 millennia fighting against. But it was too late for irony now, too late for regret, too late for anything but the completion of the dark work that had begun the moment he first listened to the whispers in the warp. Terror burned below them, and Horus Lupercal died a little more with every flame. Chapter 4. The Throne Fails Malcador. The Sigillite had not felt fear in over 2,000 years. He had stared into the heart of the warp during its most turbulent epochs. He had walked beside the Emperor through the ruins of civilizations that had fallen to their own hubris. He had seen the birth and death of stars, the rise and fall of species that had once thought themselves eternal. Fear, he had learned, was a luxury that immortals couldn't afford. But standing before the Golden Throne, as it convulsed with uncontrolled power, watching ancient systems fail one by one in cascading technological apocalypse, Malcador discovered that he had been wrong. Fear was not a luxury, it was a warning, and every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to run. The throne room had become a place of barely contained madness. Warning runes blazed across every surface, their harsh red light casting twisted shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The air itself crackled with psychic discharge, making it painful to breathe, painful to think. Tech adepts scurried between banks of failing cogitators, their mechanical voices raised in the binary cant of desperation. "Regent!" Tech adept Zephon Hall's synthesized voice cut through the chaos with mechanical precision. "The containment protocols have failed. The webway portal beneath the throne is expanding beyond our ability to monitor or control. I estimate 14 minutes before total breach." 14 minutes. Malcador closed his eyes and felt the weight of 10 millennia pressing down on his shoulders. 14 minutes to find a solution to a problem that the Emperor himself had struggled to contain for 2 centuries. 14 minutes to save not just Terra, but the entire species that looked to this world for guidance and hope. "Has anyone attempted to take his place on the throne?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The Golden Throne had been designed for one being in all the galaxy, the Emperor of mankind. Its psychic resonance frequencies were calibrated to his unique neural patterns, its power conduits shaped to channel his particular form of consciousness. For anyone else to attempt to interface with it would be like trying to channel the fury of a star through a candle wick. "Lord Regent," one of the custodians stepped forward, his golden armor dulled by the strange energies filling the chamber. "Tribune Hydo attempted contact with the machine spirit 17 minutes ago. He—" The warrior's voice carried a grief that his helmet could not hide. "He did not survive the attempt." Malcador nodded grimly. He had expected as much. The custodians were the finest warriors humanity had ever produced. their minds and bodies enhanced beyond anything short of a Primarch. If one of them could not even touch the throne's control system safely, what hope did anyone have? But someone had to try. The alternative was unthinkable. "Clear the chamber," Malcador commanded. "All personnel except essential tech adepts. I want a 50-meter perimeter around the throne itself." "Lord Regent," the custodian's voice carried a note of alarm. "You cannot mean to—" "I am the only one left with sufficient psychic power to make the attempt," Malcador said quietly. "The Emperor trusted me to stand in his place when necessary. This is such a time." The evacuation took precious minutes, time they could not spare, time that brought them closer to absolute catastrophe with each passing second. But Malcador waited with the patience of someone who had learned that haste was often the enemy of success. When the chamber was finally clear, except for a handful of tech priests monitoring from a safe distance, he approached the golden throne alone. Up close, the ancient device was even more terrifying than it appeared from across the chamber. It was less a chair than a fusion of technology and art, crafted from materials that had been old when humanity first looked up at the stars. Psychic conduits snaked across its surface like veins, pulsing with energies that made the air itself seem thick and strange. The very space around it was warped, reality bending subtly to accommodate the impossible forces contained within. Malcador placed one aged hand on the throne's armrest and immediately gasped as feedback lanced through his consciousness like molten metal. The machine spirit that dwelt within the device was not malevolent, but it was confused, desperate, searching for the familiar presence that had guided it for 2 centuries. In its confusion, it lashed out with psychic energies that could reduce a normal human to ash in seconds. But Malcador was far from normal. He had been at the Emperor's side since before the unification of Terra. He had helped craft the very principles that guided the Imperium. If anyone could survive contact with the throne, it would be him. Gritting his teeth, he settled himself into the throne's embrace. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Every nerve in his body ignited simultaneously, as the throne's systems tried to map themselves to his consciousness. But where the Emperor's mind was a blazing star of psychic power, Malcador's was more like a candle flame, bright but tiny in comparison. The throne's systems, designed to channel energies that could be felt across the galaxy, found themselves starved of the power they needed to function properly. For a moment, perhaps 30 seconds, he managed to hold the connection stable. The warning runes across the chamber flickered from red to amber as the throne systems detected his presence and began their attempt to adapt. He felt his consciousness expand, touching the edges of the vast network of psychic conduits that connected Terra to the rest of the Imperium. He could sense astropaths dying across the galaxy as they lost their connection to the Astronomicon. He could feel the webway portal beneath the palace straining against its containment like a caged beast. Then his body began to burn. The energies coursing through the throne were too vast for any mortal frame to contain. Malcador felt his cellular structure beginning to break down at the molecular level. His ancient bones, preserved for millennia by arcane technologies and sheer force of will, began to crumble like dried parchment. Blood vessels burst throughout his body as his cardiovascular system tried and failed to cope with the psychic feedback. But he held on. For the sake of the species he had helped guide since its darkest hours, he held on. The webway portal stabilized. The worst of the psychic storm emanating from the throne subsided to merely dangerous levels. Across Terra, tech priests noted with amazement that several critical systems had resumed normal function. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that Malcador's sacrifice might actually work. Then his heart stopped. The sigillite collapsed forward in the throne, his ancient frame finally overwhelmed by forces no mortal was meant to channel. As his consciousness faded, the throne systems registered the loss of their operator and immediately began to shut down safety protocols. The webway portal, held stable only by his dying will, began to tear itself apart. In the deepest levels of the Imperial Palace, Constantin Valdor felt the change like a physical blow. The Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes had been leading his warriors in a desperate battle against the demonic entities seeping through microfractures in reality when the portal beneath the palace finally tore itself open completely. The sound was indescribable, reality itself screaming as it was violated by forces that had no business existing in the material universe. The corridor where Voldor's strike force was fighting erupted in a geyser of warp stuff that defied every law of physics. Demons began pouring through the breach, not as individual entities, but as a flood of malevolent consciousness given form. "Fall back to checkpoint Sigma," Valdor commanded, his guardian spear carving through a cluster of pink horrors that giggled as they dissolved. "Seal every blast door behind us." But even as he gave the order, he knew it would not be enough. The breach was too large, the demonic incursion too massive. His warriors fought with the skill and fury that had made them legends, but they were facing an enemy that could reshape reality through will alone. Every demon they destroyed was replaced by 3 more. Every corridor they sealed was bypassed, as their enemies simply materialized on the other side of reinforced barriers. "My lord," Custodian Aquilon voxed from his position, covering the squad's retreat. "The diamonds are moving toward the upper levels. If they reach the civilian shelters—" Valdor's jaw tightened beneath his helmet. 10 billion people lived in the sprawling urban mass of Terra. Most of them were currently huddled in emergency shelters, deep beneath the planet's surface, trusting in the Emperor's protection to see them through this crisis. If demons reached those shelters, the slaughter would be beyond imagination. "Signal all available squads," he commanded. "We hold them here, whatever the cost." 3 levels above, Magos Hephaeston of the Martian Mechanicus stood in the primary technology vault and watched 2 centuries of careful innovation die before his eyes. The tech priest's optical mechadendrites tracked dozens of failing systems simultaneously, recording the death throes of machines that had been crafted during humanity's golden age. Without the Emperor's guiding presence, the most sophisticated devices on Terra were simply stopping. "Magos," one of his subordinates approached with the halting gait of someone whose lower body had been replaced with tracked locomotion systems. "The orbital defense platforms report cascading failures across their targeting arrays. The lance batteries are cycling offline, one by one." Hephaeston processed this information with the cold logic that had replaced emotion in his augmented consciousness. Terra's orbital defenses were controlled from deep within the Imperial Palace, their machine spirits linked to a vast network that ultimately traced back to the Golden Throne itself. With that connection severed, the automated systems that protected humanity's homeworld were becoming inert metal floating in the void. "Estimated time until total defensive failure?" he asked. 47 minutes, Magos. Perhaps less if the cascade accelerates. 47 minutes until Terra stood naked before Horus's fleet. 47 minutes until the planet that had given birth to humanity's greatest dreams became vulnerable to orbital bombardment that could crack continents. "Signal Lord Dawn," Hephaeston commanded. "Inform him that our defensive umbrella is collapsing. He needs to know." The message reached Rogel Dawn as he stood in the palace's central command center, surrounded by maps and tactical displays that showed the deteriorating situation across Terra. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists had been planning defensive strategies for so long that it had become second nature, calculating fields of fire, optimizing troop placement, identifying the key points where a disciplined force could hold against overwhelming odds. But every plan he conceived required certain assumptions about available resources and defensive capabilities. Those assumptions were crumbling along with everything else. "Lord Dawn," Captain Sigismund approached with the measured pace of a warrior who had learned to deliver bad news without flinching. "Reports from all sectors. The outer palace defenses have lost primary power to their main guns. The void shield generators are operating on emergency power only. And the orbital platforms—" He paused, clearly reluctant to continue. "My lord, we no longer have effective orbital coverage." Dawn studied the tactical display with eyes that had witnessed 1,000 battles across 100 worlds. The defensive positions marked in green were steadily turning yellow, then red, as one system after another failed. The outer palace, which had been designed to hold against a siege for decades, was becoming untenable. "How long can the inner palace hold?" he asked. "With full defensive systems, months. But with our current capabilities—" Sigismund's scarred features were grim beneath his helmet. "Days. Perhaps a week, if we're fortunate." Dawn was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that all led to the same inevitable conclusion. The Emperor was dead. Terra's defenses were failing. Horus commanded overwhelming force and would not make the mistake of allowing them time to adapt to their new circumstances. The only question was whether they would die in the outer palace or the inner palace, and whether that distinction would matter to anyone besides the historians who would never exist to record their final stand. "Signal all commands," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Abandon the outer defensive perimeters. Fall back to the inner palace walls. We consolidate our remaining strength there." The order went out across Terra like a death knell. Imperial fists who had held their positions against impossible odds began their fighting withdrawal deeper into the palace complex. Void shield generators that had protected vast areas of the planet's surface were shut down and their power redirected to the innermost defensive rings. Civilians who had sheltered in outer areas were evacuated deeper underground, their faces showing the hollow understanding that their world was ending. From the highest spire of the palace, Rogel Dawn looked out over the planet his father had called home and watched the lights going out one by one. In the distance, he could see the first signs of Horus's assault beginning, new stars blooming in the darkness as landing craft entered Terra's atmosphere like falling angels. The siege was about to become a slaughter, and there was nothing left he could do to prevent it. Chapter 5. Brothers in Darkness. The astropathic sanctum had never been a place of comfort, but now it felt like a tomb. Rogel Dawn stood at the center of the vast chamber, surrounded by the hunched forms of Terra's surviving telepaths as they struggled to pierce the psychic darkness that had fallen across the galaxy. Without the Astronomicon to guide their messages through the warp, astropathic communication had become a desperate gamble, like shouting into a storm and hoping someone, somewhere, might hear. The air in the sanctum reeked of blood and ozone. Half the astropaths were dead, their minds burned out in the psychic backlash that had followed the Emperor's passing. The survivors huddled in their meditation circles, their augmented skulls gleaming with moisture as they strained to reach across impossible distances, with nothing but raw will and fading hope. Primarch, Master Astropath Cordian approached with the careful gait of someone whose world had just ended. His empty eye sockets wept tears of blood, a sign that he had pushed his abilities past their safe limits. "We have made contact with the Macraga system. The connection is unstable." Dawn's jaw tightened. Robot Gilliman was more than 400 light-years away, commanding the 500 worlds of Ultramar. In better times, with the Astronomicon to guide their messages, An astropathic communication to Macragge would have been routine. Now it was a miracle. "Connect me," Dawn commanded. The process was agony to watch. 3 astropaths linked their minds in a psychic chain, their bodies convulsing as they forced their consciousness through the chaotic currents of the warp. Blood began to pool beneath their chairs as the effort took its toll, but slowly, impossibly, a connection formed. Guilliman's voice came through the psychic link like an echo from across an ocean, distorted and faint, but unmistakably his. "Rogel, brother, we felt the darkness fallness. What has happened to the Emperor?" "He is dead." Dawn spoke the words aloud, knowing the astropaths would transmit not just his words, but the weight of grief behind them. "Slain by Horus, aboard the vengeful spirit. Terra's defenses are failing. I need to know, can you reach us? How quickly can the Ultramarines deploy?" The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. When Guilliman's response finally came, it carried a despair that chilled Dawn to his core. "Brother, Ultramar is under siege. Word-bearers, Alpha Legion. They struck our outer systems the moment the Astronomicon failed. It is all I can do to hold Macragge itself. I cannot spare even a single company." Dawn closed his eyes. Of course, the traitors had planned this carefully. The moment the Emperor died, and the Astronomicon failed, they had struck at every loyal world simultaneously. While Horus assaulted Terra, his brother traitors were ensuring that no help could come from the scattered loyal forces. "What of the others?" Dawn asked. "Have you had contact with the Lion? Vulcan? Any of our remaining brothers?" Nothing. Guilliman's mental voice grew weaker as the astropaths struggled to maintain the connection. "The warp storms, without the Emperor's light to guide us. We are islands in an endless dark sea." The connection began to fracture, Guilliman's presence growing more distant with each passing second. "Rogel, listen to me. If Terra falls, if you cannot hold, Ultramar will preserve what it can. The dream of the Imperium will live on. We will not let humanity fall into darkness entirely. Reboot." But the connection was gone, severed as the astropaths collapsed in their chairs, overwhelmed by the effort of reaching across the galaxy without their guiding star. Dawn stared at the fallen telepaths for a long moment, feeling the weight of absolute isolation settling on his shoulders. Guilliman was fighting for his own survival, 400 light-years away. The other loyal Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy, cut off by warp storms and traitor fleets. Terra stood alone. "Master Cordian," he said quietly, "can you attempt contact with the Lion, with Lion L. Johnson?" The surviving astropath wiped blood from his empty sockets and nodded weakly. "I will try, my lord. But the distance, and his fleet has been moving through the northern reaches. It may be impossible to try." The second attempt was even more harrowing than the first. Master Cordian linked his mind with 2 junior astropaths, their combined will barely strong enough to pierce the psychic storms raging through the warp. For nearly an hour they strained, their bodies racked with seizures as they fought to establish any connection at all with the distant Dark Angel's fleet. When contact finally came, it was not with the Lion himself, but with one of his senior librarians, a warrior mystic whose psychic abilities had been honed through decades of combat against the enemies of mankind. "Terra calls for aid." The librarian's mind voice was heavy with exhaustion. "We hear you, Sons of Dawn. But we are lost." "Lost?" Dawn stepped closer to the struggling astropaths, as if physical proximity could somehow strengthen the fragile connection. "Explain." The Lion received word of the Emperor's death through other means. The consequences have been severe. We have been fighting warp storms for 3 days now. Navigation is impossible. Our navigators speak of currents that lead nowhere, of stars that have gone out. The galaxy itself seems to be changing. The words sent a chill through Dawn's superhuman physiology. The Astronomicon did more than guide ships. It was a stabilizing influence on the warp itself, a lighthouse that held back the worst of the Empyrean's madness. Without it, the very fabric of space-time was beginning to warp and twist in ways that defied comprehension. "The Lion seeks to reach Terra," the librarian continued, his mental voice growing weaker. "But we may be months away, perhaps years. Time itself flows strangely here in the deep warp. We will come, brothers, but we cannot promise when." Years. By the time the Lion fought his way through the warp storms to reach Terra, there would be nothing left to save but ash and bone. "What of our father's other sons?" Dawn asked desperately. "Vulcan! Any word of Vulcan?" Nothing. The connection was fading now, the astropath's strength nearly exhausted. Since Istvan, since the drop site massacre, Vulcan has been silence. We do not know if he lives, or if he has joined the Emperor in death. The link severed abruptly as one of the junior astropaths collapsed entirely, blood streaming from every orifice. Master Cordian slumped in his chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No more, my lord," he whispered. "We have lost too many. Another attempt will kill us all." Dawn nodded slowly. He had his answer, such as it was. The loyal Primarchs were scattered and isolated, fighting their own desperate battles across a galaxy plunged into chaos. Guilliman was besieged in Ultramar. The Lion was lost in warp storms that might strand him for years. Vulcan's fate was unknown. He might be dead, or worse. The other loyal sons were either dead, missing, or too distant to matter. Terra was alone. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists walked to the great viewing port that looked out over the sprawling cityscape of humanity's birthworld. In the distance, he could see the glow of fires, some from damaged infrastructure, others from the beginning stages of Horus's orbital bombardment. The sky itself looked wrong, painted in unnatural hues, as the warp pressed closer to reality, without the Emperor's will to hold it back. Behind him, tech adepts worked frantically to evacuate the surviving astropaths to more secure locations deeper in the palace. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that they were witnessing the end of an age. The astropathic sanctum, once the nerve center of galactic communication, had become useless. Without the Astronomicon, the vast network that had connected the million worlds of the Imperium was simply gone. Captain Sigismund found him there an hour later, standing motionless at the window, like a statue carved from living stone. The first captain of the Imperial Fists approached with the measured gait of a warrior who had seen too much in too short a time. "My lord," Sigismund said quietly. "Fleet Command reports that Horus's ships are moving into closer orbital positions. Our remaining defense platforms are tracking increased Lance battery activity. They estimate the bombardment will intensify within the hour." Dawn did not turn from the window. "Any word from our brothers?" Sigismund's scarred features grew grim beneath his helmet. "Guilliman fights for Ultramar itself. The Lion is lost in the warp. The others—" He paused, clearly reluctant to voice what they both knew. "The others will not reach us in time." "Then we make our stand here," Dawn said simply. "With what we have. As we are. My lord, perhaps if we sent out a general distress call—" "To whom?" Dawn finally turned, and Sigismund stepped back involuntarily at the glacial fury in his Primarch's eyes. "Who remains to hear us? What loyal world has the strength to spare aid when the galaxy itself is tearing apart at the seams?" The captain had no answer. They both knew the truth. that Horus had planned this moment carefully, striking at the precise instant when the loyal forces would be most scattered and vulnerable. The moment the Emperor died, every loyal world had become an island in a sea of chaos, fighting for survival without hope of reinforcement. "Signal all defensive positions," Dawn commanded. "Full alert status. No one sleeps, no one rests. Horus will come for the palace soon, and when he does, we will make him pay for every meter of ground." He paused, looking back out at the darkening sky. "How many Imperial fists remain?" 7,000, my lord, plus perhaps 2,000 blood angels who survived the retreat from the outer defenses. The custodians number fewer than 1,000. The mortal forces. Sigismund's voice carried the weight of impossible mathematics. Perhaps 3 million, counting the PDF regiments that have maintained cohesion. 3 million defenders against Horus's 100,000 Astartes, supported by demon engines, corrupted titans, and the unlimited legions of the warp itself. In any conventional sense, it was hopeless. But Rogel Dawn had not spent 2 centuries building the most formidable fortress in human space, just to surrender it without a fight. "Then we have our orders," he said quietly. "Hold the palace. Protect the civilians. Make them remember that even in humanity's darkest hour, some among us refused to kneel." As Sigismund departed to relay the orders, Dawn remained at the window, watching the first of Horus's landing craft begin their descent through Terra's poisoned atmosphere. Each ship carried warriors who had once been brothers, Astartes who had fought beside the defenders in the great campaigns of the Crusade. Now they came as conquerors, servants of powers that wanted nothing but humanity's complete and utter destruction. The thought should have filled him with despair. Instead, it filled him with something colder and more enduring, the absolute determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. His father was dead. His brothers were scattered and isolated. The Imperium was crumbling into civil war and madness. But Terra still stood. The palace still flew the Imperial Aquila, and as long as Rogel Dawn drew breath, that would not change, even if he had to hold the walls alone. Chapter 6. The palace burns. The Reaver Titan Mortisbringer stood 200 meters tall and carried enough firepower Totas tall and carried enough firepower to level a city. When it breached the outer walls of the Imperial Palace, the sound was like the death scream of a world. Ancient adamantium barriers that had withstood sieges for 2 millennia crumpled like parchment before the war machine's volcano cannon. Stone that had been blessed by the Emperor's own hands vaporized in superheated plasma. The wall that had never fallen simply ceased to exist. Behind the Titan came things that had no name in any human language. Demon engines that walked on legs of living bone, their hull-mounted weapons weeping acidic tears that ate through reinforced ferrocrete. Defilers that scuttled across the rubble like metallic spiders, their battle cannon barrels glowing with warp fire. And behind them all, the traitor legions themselves, Astartes in corrupted power armor, their once proud heraldry now twisted into symbols that hurt to look at directly. Captain Sigismund of the Imperial Fists watched the outer wall die and felt something cold settle in his chest. He had known this moment would come, had planned for it, prepared for it, accepted it. But seeing 2 centuries of careful fortification reduced to burning rubble in the span of minutes was different from knowing it would happen. It was the difference between understanding death and watching your own heart stop beating. All squads fall back to Checkpoint Delta, he voxed to his scattered companies. Around him, Imperial Fists moved with the discipline of warriors who had trained for this exact scenario 1,000 times. But training could not fully prepare anyone for the reality of fighting demon engines in the corridors where they had once stood guard over humanity's greatest treasures. The palace was built like a maze, deliberately so. Even if the outer walls fell, attackers would have to fight through kilometers of interconnected passages, chambers, and courtyards to reach the throne room at its heart. Every corridor was a potential killing ground. Every junction offered multiple firing positions. Every room could be turned into a fortress if necessary. But the enemy they faced was not bound by conventional tactical limitations. Demon engines could phase through solid walls when the warp ran strong enough. Khorne berserkers felt no pain and knew no fear. Tzeentch sorcerers could teleport entire squads past carefully prepared defensive positions, and behind them all came the endless tide of cultists and traitor guardsmen who served chaos not out of conviction, but out of simple terror of what would happen if they refused. Sergeant Thane of the Blood Angels crouched behind a pillar that had been carved from a single piece of Terran marble, its surface depicting scenes from the Great Crusade. The irony was not lost on him that he was now fighting for his life in the shadow of artwork, celebrating humanity's greatest triumphs. His bolt pistol tracked a word-bearer advancing down the corridor, one of Lorgar's sons, his power armor painted in the deep red that spoke of blood spilled in service to dark gods. The bolt round took the traitor in the chest, detonating against his breastplate and staggering him backward. But the word-bearer didn't fall. Instead, he raised his bolt gun and returned fire while chanting in a language that made Thane's ears bleed just to hear it. The sergeant rolled to new cover as explosive rounds chipped stone from the ancient pillar. This was not how wars were supposed to be fought. This was desecration. 3 levels above, Brother Captain Kassan led a fighting withdrawal through the Hall of Victories, a vast gallery lined with trophies taken during the Great Crusade. Banners from conquered worlds hung from the vaulted ceiling. Weapons surrendered by defeated alien empires gleamed in display cases. At the hall's center stood a massive diorama, showing the Emperor alongside his Primarchs, crafted by the finest artisans Terra had ever produced. The Iron Warriors who pursued them cared nothing for the historical significance of what they were destroying. They fired indiscriminately, their bolters reducing priceless artifacts to splinters. Ancient texts burned, irreplaceable artwork shattered. 2 centuries of careful curation died in minutes of mindless violence. "Sir," Sergeant Corvani's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Request permission to make a stand here. We cannot let them destroy—" "We fall back," Kassan cut him off, though his own voice carried the same pain. "That is an order, Sergeant. The artifacts can be replaced. The gene seed cannot." But even as he said it, he knew he was lying. Nothing in this hall could be replaced. When humanity's darkest hour had passed, if it passed, the species would be immeasurably poorer for what was being lost here. The Iron Warriors were not just conquering the palace, they were erasing human history. 20 levels below the fighting, in the deep shelters that had been carved from Terra's bedrock during the Age of Strife, 10 million civilians huddled in the darkness and listened to their world end above them. The shelter system had been designed to house the palace's entire population in the event of orbital bombardment. It had thick walls, independent life support, and enough supplies to last for years. But the engineers who had designed it had never imagined that the attackers would be entities that could walk through solid matter or summon fire from the Empyrean itself. Magda Voss held her daughter close, as something that might once have been human screamed in the corridor outside their shelter. She had been a scribe in the palace's vast administrative complex, one of millions of clerks and bureaucrats who kept the Imperium's paperwork flowing in orderly streams. Now she was just another refugee, clutching a laspistol she had never been trained to use, and hoping that the meter-thick plasteel door would be enough to keep the monsters at bay. It wasn't. The door began to glow cherry red as something on the other side applied focused heat to its surface. The civilians pressed back against the far wall, some weeping, others praying to an emperor who would never answer them again. Children who had never seen violence worse than a playground scuffle stared with wide eyes at adults who had no comfort left to offer. When the door finally failed, it was not with the dramatic explosion Magda had expected. Instead, it simply began to melt, slumping inward like heated wax. Through the growing gap came laughter, the sound of something that had once been human, but had given up its humanity in exchange for power. The last thing Magda saw before the screaming started was a hand that ended in claws instead of fingers, reaching through the molten metal with casual ease. High in the palace's command center, Rogel Dawn studied tactical displays that told a story of systematic destruction. Red icons marked breached defensive positions. Yellow showed contested areas where his warriors still fought. Green indicated positions that remained secure, and there were fewer green icons with each passing minute. "Sir," Captain Hager approached with the measured gait of someone delivering a death sentence. "The eastern galleries have fallen. Enemy forces are pushing toward the librarium. And, sir," he paused, clearly reluctant to continue. "Sergeant Thane reports demon engines in the civilian shelters. The creatures are not bound by conventional defenses." Dawn's hands tightened into fists. The librarium contained 30,000 years of human knowledge, texts from old Earth, records of the Great Crusade, scientific treatises that had taken generations to compile. If it burned, humanity would lose more than territory. It would lose its memory. "Signal Tech Magos Hephaeston," he commanded. "Authorization Omega 77. Deploy the Archaeotech weapons." Hager's scarred features went pale beneath his helmet. The Archaeotech weapons were relics from humanity's dark age, devices of such power and unpredictability that they had been sealed away for good reason. Some were unstable. Others carried risks that made their use almost as dangerous as defeat itself. They were the weapons of absolute last resort. "My lord," Hager said carefully, "the tech adepts have warned that some of those devices have not been activated since. I know the risks, Captain. Deploy them anyway." The authorization went out through the palace's failing communication network, reaching tech priests in hidden vaults who had spent their entire lives maintaining devices they had never expected to use. Ancient servitors ground to life in forgotten chambers. Vault doors that had been sealed with the Emperor's own authorization marks began to cycle open. The first weapon to deploy was something called a vortex cannon, a device that created temporary tears in reality itself. When the tech adepts wheeled it into position overlooking the main breach in the eastern wall, even the Chaos Space Marines stopped their advance to stare at it. The weapon looked wrong, as if it had been designed according to principles that violated several laws of physics. When it fired, the world briefly turned inside out. The blast did not make a sound. Instead, it created a sphere of absolute nothingness that consumed everything within a 50-meter radius, stone, metal, demon, and traitor marine alike. The sphere lingered for perhaps 3 seconds before collapsing back into normal space, leaving behind a perfectly spherical crater and the lingering sensation that reality had been wounded. The advance through that section halted entirely, as even chaos-maddened warriors recognized that some things were too dangerous to approach. But the palace had hundreds of breaches now, and only a handful of Archaeotech weapons. Each deployment bought time and space at an incredible cost, not just in resources, but in the growing instability of local reality. The devices were not meant to be used in such numbers or in such proximity to each other. Their combined effects began to warp the palace itself, creating pockets where gravity ran sideways or time moved at different speeds. Brother Sergeant Catafalque of the Imperial Fists found himself fighting in one such pocket, where his bolter rounds aged decades in flight and arrived as dust. The word-bearers he faced moved like men underwater. Their corrupt prayers stretched into endless drones. The battle felt like a fever dream, where cause and effect became suggestions rather than laws. But even in the warped reality of the failing palace, duty remained absolute. "Hold the line," he commanded his squad, though his voice sounded strange in the distorted air. "Whatever happens, we hold the line." They held for 23 minutes against overwhelming odds before the last of them fell. When Chaos Marines finally pushed through their position, they found Imperial Fists who had died standing upright, their weapons empty, but their gene seed intact. It was a small victory in the face of absolute defeat, but it was still a victory. Captain Sigismund received word of the squad's fate as he led his own desperate charge against a defiler that had broken through near the Hall of Memory. The demon engine stood 4 meters tall and bristled with weapons that fired rounds designed to cause maximum suffering rather than quick death. Its pilot, if the writhing mass of flesh and metal inside its cockpit could be called a pilot, laughed with multiple voices as it cut down Imperial Fists with precise, economical bursts. Sigismund had faced worse odds before, but never against an enemy that took active joy in the process of killing. The defiler seemed to relish each fallen defender, pausing between kills to observe the results of its handiwork. It was not trying to advance quickly. It was trying to make the defenders suffer. "For the Emperor!" Sigismund roared as he charged, his power sword crackling with energy that seemed pale and weak in comparison to the warp-touched weapons around him. But his blade found the demon engine's leg joint, slicing through corrupted metal with the fury of absolute faith. The defiler staggered, its pilot's laughter turning to something that might have been surprise. It swiveled toward Sigismund with movements that defied the mechanical nature of its chassis, too fluid, too organic. Multiple weapon arms tracked toward him with the promise of overwhelming firepower. Then, Brother Captain Kassan's squad hit the demon engine from the flank, their melter bombs turning its right side into molten slag. The creature's death scream was a sound that belonged in no sane universe, but it was still the sound of victory. "Status report," Sigismund demanded, as he and Kassan took cover behind the demon engine's cooling wreckage. "We have lost the eastern galleries, the civilian quarters, and approximately 60% of the defensive positions on levels 1 through 15, Kassan reported, with the clinical precision of someone who had learned to treat catastrophe as data. Estimated enemy strength still exceeds our own by a factor of 20 to 1. Sigismund nodded. The mathematics of their situation had been clear from the beginning. They were not fighting to win. They were fighting to ensure that when Terra fell, it would cost Horus more than he had expected to pay. Around them, the palace continued to burn. Ancient walls collapsed under the weight of weapons that should not exist. Treasures that had been preserved since humanity's earliest days crumbled into ash and memory. But in the deepest vaults, protected by the sacrifice of warriors who died standing in place, the most precious artifacts of human civilization waited in the darkness. Perhaps when the shooting stopped and the screaming ended, something of humanity's legacy would survive to remember what they had been before the darkness claimed them. Perhaps. Chapter 7. The Last Stand. The throne room had become a fortress within a fortress, its ancient doors sealed with emergency blast shields that had never been designed for use. Rogel Dawn stood at the chamber's center, his yellow armor scarred and blackened from 6 hours of continuous fighting. Around him, the survivors of humanity's greatest legion gathered in a final circle of defiance. 43 imperial fists, 18 blood angels, and 27 custodians. The cream of human military achievement reduced to fewer than 100 warriors making their last stand in the holiest place on Terra. The golden throne loomed behind them like a dying god. Without the Emperor's presence to guide its functions, the ancient device had become something between a weapon and a wound in reality itself. Psychic energy discharged from its surfaces in random patterns, creating areas where gravity failed or time moved backward. The very air around it shimmered with forces that the human mind was not equipped to comprehend. And at its base, Malcador the Sigillite knelt in meditation, his ancient form racked with convulsions as he attempted something that no mortal was meant to survive. "Sigillite," Dawn said quietly, approaching the aged regent with the careful steps of someone who understood. They were witnessing a martyrdom. "The webway portal. Can you seal it?" Malcador did not open his eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of millennia. "Perhaps. For a time. But it will require—" He paused, his breath coming in labored gasps. "Everything I am. Everything I have ever been. And even then, it may not be enough." Behind the blast doors, something that had once been a song began to echo through the palace corridors. It was the sound of 100,000 voices raised in harmony, but the melody they sang belonged in no human throat. The word-bearers had begun their final ritual, a consecration that would turn the throne room itself into a shrine to the ruinous powers. "How long do we have?" Captain Sigismund asked. He stood at the room's primary entrance, his power sword drawn and crackling with energy that seemed pale compared to the warp-touched forces gathering outside. Behind him, the remaining imperial fists checked their weapons with the methodical precision of warriors who knew they would not live to clean them again. "Minutes," Dawn replied simply. "The blast doors will not hold against what is coming." What was coming was Horus himself, the Primarch of the Lunar Wolves, or the thing that had once been Horus, had finally decided to claim his prize in person. Dawn could feel his brother's approach like a storm front, moving across the landscape of reality. The very stones of the palace groaned as his presence warped local space-time. Lights flickered. Gravity fluctuated. The boundary between the material universe and the warp grew thin enough to see through. Brother Captain Kassan of the Blood Angels knelt beside the bodies of 3 custodians who had died defending the inner approaches. Their golden armor was unmarked. They had been killed not by weapons, but by exposure to raw chaos energy that had stopped their hearts through sheer proximity. He closed their sightless eyes with hands that shook despite his superhuman control. "There is no shame in this," he said to his surviving battle brothers. "We die as we lived, in service to humanity's dream of something better than darkness." The words carried more weight than he had intended. In the space of 6 hours, they had watched that dream crumble into ash and ruin. The Imperium that had united 1,000,000 worlds under the banner of human excellence was ending here, in this room, defended by fewer than 100 warriors against the combined might of hell itself. But they would make it cost something. The first blast door failed with a sound like reality tearing. Through the gap came laughter. Not human laughter, but the sound of entropy given voice. Pink fire danced in the corridor beyond, and shadows moved with purpose that defied the laws of physics. The smell that followed was indescribable. Corruption and perfection, decay and rebirth, all the contradictions of chaos distilled into something that made mortal senses rebel. "First rank, fire!" Sigismund commanded. Bolt rounds streamed through the opening, their mass-reactive tips detonating against armor that had been twisted beyond recognition. Some found their targets. Most simply vanished into the warp-touched air as if they had never existed. But the defenders fired anyway, because it was what they knew how to do, and because standing still in the face of absolute evil was not in their nature. The second blast door lasted 30 seconds longer than the first. When it fell, the throne room was briefly illuminated by light that belonged to no star that had ever shone on Terra. In that impossible radiance, the defenders caught their first glimpse of what their enemy had become. The creature that entered was 8 feet tall and wore the shape of Horus Lupercal, like an ill-fitting mask. Its armor had fused with its flesh in ways that suggested both had been remade according to principles that owed nothing to human engineering. 4 sets of eyes burned in its skull: brass fire for Khorne, silver flame for Tzeentch, diseased green for Nurgle, and the blinding purple of Slaanesh. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus of godlike powers speaking through a single throat. "Brother," the thing that had been Horus said, and Dawn felt his heart skip a beat at hearing his own name spoken with such casual fondness by something that should not exist. "I have missed you." Dawn raised his storm bolter, knowing it would accomplish nothing but needing to make the gesture anyway. "You are not my brother. My brother died the moment he knelt before the ruinous powers." "Did I?" Horus stepped into the throne room with movements that left brief tears in the air itself. "Or did I simply become something greater than the limitations my father placed on me?" He looked around the chamber with eyes that saw too much, took in the cowering survivors and the failing throne and the desperate old man attempting to hold reality together through willpower alone. How small it all looks now. How mortal. Behind him came the Just Aaron, his personal guard, transformed by chaos into something between Astartes and demon. Their weapons leaked power that made the air itself catch fire. Their armor bore the symbols of all 4 gods, simultaneously, a heraldic impossibility that hurt to perceive directly. "You have fought well," Horus continued, his voice carrying harmonics that bypassed the ear and spoke directly to the soul. "I will make your deaths quick. It is the least I can do for the sons of my beloved brother." "No." The word came from Malcador, still kneeling at the throne's base. The sigillite raised his head, and his ancient features were lit with determination that bordered on madness. "If you would claim this place, you will have to go through me first." Horus laughed, and it was the sound of stars going out. "You, old man, you are nothing. A footnote in my father's grand design. What could you possibly do to—" His words cut off as Malcador rose to his feet and placed both hands on the golden throne's control matrix. The response was immediate and catastrophic. Every psychic conduit in the device activated simultaneously, channeling energies that had been building without direction since the Emperor's death. The webway portal beneath the palace, the wound in reality that had been bleeding demons into Terra's heart for hours, suddenly contracted as Malcador's will pressed against it like a giant hand. The effort was killing him. Dawn could see it happening in real time, cellular breakdown at the molecular level as the sigillite's body tried and failed to contain forces that were meant for a god. Blood vessels burst throughout his frame. His bones began to crack audibly. The skin of his hands, pressed against the throne's contact points, began to char and blacken. But the portal was closing. "Impossible," Horus snarled. And for the first time since entering the room, he sounded genuinely surprised. No mortal mind can command that much power. "I am no ordinary mortal," Malcador gasped, his voice barely audible over the thunder of psychic forces being wrestled into submission. "I have walked beside gods. I have shaped the destiny of our species, and I will not let you have this place without paying the price I choose." The portal snapped shut with a sound like reality healing itself. The sudden cessation of demonic incursion left a silence so profound it felt like deafness. For a moment, perhaps 5 seconds, the throne room was merely a chamber where mortals fought for the future of their species. Then Malkador collapsed, his ancient body finally overwhelmed by forces no human frame was meant to channel. As he fell, his eyes found dawns across the chamber, and in them the Primarch saw something like satisfaction. "It is finished," the Sigillite whispered, and died. The silence that followed was broken by Horus's roar of fury, a sound that shattered every piece of glass in the chamber and drove several of the surviving Astartes to their knees. When he moved, it was with speed that belonged to something beyond physical law. One moment he stood at the chamber's entrance. The next, he was among the defenders, his power claws carving through armor and flesh with casual ease. Sigismund met him first, his power sword blazing with righteous fury as he threw himself into a duel with the being that had once been his Gene Father's favorite son. For perhaps 30 seconds, he held his ground through skill and fury and absolute devotion to duty. His blade found the gaps in Horus's corrupted armor, drew ichor that bubbled and hissed as it struck the ancient stones. But skill could not overcome the power of gods made manifest. Horus's claws punched through Sigismund's breastplate as if it were paper, lifting the first captain of the Imperial Fists off the ground with negligent ease. "You were always the best of them," Horus said, almost gently, as Sigismund's life ebbed away. "In another timeline, you might have served at my side willingly." He let the body fall to the stones with the sound of armor striking marble. But that timeline is not this one. The slaughter that followed was systematic and thorough. The custodians died standing in place, their guardian spears raised in final defiance. The blood angels fell with their Gene Father's name on their lips, their sacrifice buying, perhaps, seconds of additional time. The Imperial Fists formed squares around their fallen comrades, fighting to the last man to protect Geneseed that might yet serve humanity in some distant future. Dawn himself lasted longest, not because he was the most skilled fighter present, though he was, but because Horus seemed to take perverse pleasure in saving the best for last. When they finally met in single combat over the bodies of their fallen sons, it was with the weight of 2 centuries of brotherhood turned to bitter enmity. "It didn't have to be this way," Horus said, as their blades met in showers of sparks. "You could have joined me, could have stood at my side as I reshaped the galaxy according to a more honest design." "Honest?" Dawn's storm bolter spoke, its rounds detonating harmlessly against his brother's corrupted flesh. "You serve beings that exist only to spread suffering. What honesty is there in that?" "The honesty of power acknowledging what it is," Horus replied, his claws finding the joint in Dawn's shoulder guard. "Father pretended to be righteous while conquering 1,000,000 worlds through force. I simply admit that might makes right, and that the strong will always rule the weak." Their duel ranged across the throne room, 2 demigods fighting for the right to determine humanity's future. But the outcome was never in doubt. Dawn was perhaps the finest warrior among the Primarchs, but Horus now carried the blessings of all 4 Chaos gods. When the end came, it was swift. Horus's power claw punched through Dawn's primary heart, the curved talons emerging from between his shoulder blades in a spray of golden blood. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists looked down at the wound with something like surprise, then met his brother's gaze with eyes that held no fear. "Terra will remember," he whispered. "What we were, what we chose to be. Will it?" Horus let the body fall beside the golden throne, next to Malcador's still form. Or will it simply remember that in the end, despite all your father's grand plans, chaos won? The throne room fell silent, except for the electrical hum of failing machinery. Horus stood alone among the dead, surrounded by the corpses of humanity's finest defenders. Steam rose from cooling blood as the chamber's environmental systems tried and failed to process air thick with the scent of death. Behind him, his Justerin guard entered the chamber with weapons lowered. There was no one left to kill. Terra's last defense had died with the men who lay scattered across the ancient stones. Horus approached the golden throne with steps that left brief flames in the air. The device that had once guided humanity through its greatest age now sat empty and failing, its psychic emanations growing weaker with each passing second. Soon it would be nothing more than an elaborate chair, but it would serve his purposes well enough. When Horus settled himself onto the golden throne, the device responded to his presence with reluctant recognition. Its machine spirit, confused and traumatized by its creator's death, attempted to interface with this new consciousness. What it found there made it recoil in digital horror, but Horus's will was absolute. Enhanced by the power of 4 gods and unconstrained by human conscience, he forced the throne systems to accept his presence. Ancient technologies that had been crafted to serve the master of mankind now bent to the will of chaos itself. Across Terra, the few surviving defenders felt the moment their world died. In hidden bunkers and forgotten shelters, the last loyal humans looked up at ceilings that suddenly seemed thinner, more fragile. They could feel something vast and malevolent settling into the heart of their planet like a parasite claiming a corpse. The Imperium of Man was dead. In its place, something new and terrible was being born, and at its heart sat Horus Lupercal, no longer the idealistic young Primarch who had once dreamed of bringing peace to the galaxy. The being on the throne was something else entirely, a conduit for powers that wanted nothing but the slow, agonizing corruption of everything humanity had ever built or dreamed of becoming. Terra had fallen. The Emperor was dead. The dream was over. The nightmare had begun. Chapter 8. A Galaxy Divided. The message reached Macraga 3 days after Terra fell, carried by an astropath who died the moment she finished delivering it. Her final words, spoken through lips that bled with the strain of communication across impossible distances, were simple and final. The Emperor is dead. Horus has claimed the throne. Terra burns. Robut Guilliman stood in the strategium of his flagship Macraga's honor, and felt the foundation of everything he had believed in crumble beneath his feet. Around him, his staff officers waited in silence that carried the weight of impending catastrophe. Through the great viewing port, the embattled system of Ultramar stretched before them. 500 worlds that had once been the jewel of imperial space, now an island of defiance in a galaxy gone mad. "Confirm the transmission," he said quietly, though he already knew the truth of it. The darkness that had fallen across the galaxy 3 days ago, the sudden silence of the Astronomicon, the way reality itself seemed to recoil from certain directions, all of it made sense now. The unthinkable had happened. The God Emperor of mankind was dead. Master Astropath Telephas stepped forward, his ancient features marked by the strain of receiving communications that had traveled through a warp gone savage without its guiding light. "My lord, we have corroborated the report through fragments from 17 different sources. The details vary, but the core facts remain consistent. The Emperor fell in battle with the War Master aboard his flagship. Terra's defenses collapsed. The palace has fallen to Chaos forces." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a full minute. Outside the McCragger's honor, the void burned with the light of a dozen battles as Word-Bearer and Alpha Legion fleets pressed their assault against Ultramar's outer defensive rings. The attacks had begun the moment the Astronomicon failed, coordinated strikes designed to prevent any loyal force from interfering with Horus's final victory. "What of our brothers?" Captain Sicarius asked, his scarred features grim beneath his helmet. "Any word from the other loyal Primarchs?" "Fragmentary reports only," Telephus replied. "The Lion's fleet was last detected in the Thramas sector, engaged with Night Lord's forces. Communication has been sporadic. There are unconfirmed reports of a massive fleet movement toward the galactic core, but whether it represents aid or additional threat is unknown." Guilliman nodded slowly, his strategic mind already processing the implications. With the Emperor dead and Terra fallen, the Imperium as a political entity had ceased to exist. What remained were scattered islands of loyalty in a sea of chaos, local governors and military commanders who still believed in the imperial ideal, but lacked any central authority to coordinate their resistance. "Signal the Ultramar Senate," he commanded. "Emergency session, full mobilization protocols, and—" He paused, the weight of what he was about to say settling on his shoulders like a funeral shroud. "Draft the Articles of Succession." The Articles of Succession had been a theoretical document, something the Ultramar legal scholars had drafted during the early days of the Great Crusade as a contingency plan for the unthinkable. If the Emperor were to die and the Imperium were to collapse, how would Ultramar preserve the ideals he had represented? How would they maintain civilization in the face of galactic barbarism? Now those theoretical documents would become the foundation for humanity's future, or what remained of it. Captain Ventress, one of Guilliman's most trusted advisers, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "My lord, are we certain this is the correct course? To declare independence from the Imperium while it still exists in some form?" "What Imperium?" Guilliman's voice carried a bitterness that his warriors had never heard before. "Horus sits on the golden throne. Terra burns under the banners of chaos. The Astronomicon is dark. Half the galaxy has already fallen to civil war." He gestured toward the tactical displays showing the embattled state of local space. "We can spend our strength trying to restore something that no longer exists, or we can preserve what we can for the future." The implications were staggering. Ultramar contained some of the most advanced industrial worlds in the galaxy, shipyards capable of building vessels that could challenge anything in the traitor fleets, and a military-industrial complex that had supplied significant portions of the Great Crusade. If Guilliman declared independence and focused on defending the 500 worlds, he could preserve a significant portion of human civilization, even if everything else fell to chaos. But it would mean abandoning billions of loyal Imperial citizens to their fate. "Sir," Sicarius said carefully, "what of our oaths? Our duty to humanity as a whole?" Guilliman was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the burning void where his ships held the line against impossible odds. "Our duty is to ensure that humanity has a future, Captain. That duty does not change because the Emperor is dead. If anything, it becomes more vital." 800 light-years away, in the cold reaches of the Thramas sector, Lion L. Johnson received word of Terra's fall through dreams that bled. The Primarch of the Dark Angels sat in the meditation chamber of his flagship Invincible Reason, his pale features unmarked by emotion, as visions of his father's death played out in his mind's eye. The Lion had always possessed a connection to the warp that he did not fully understand, a heritage that allowed him to see truths that others missed. What he saw in his dreams filled him with rage that burned colder than the void between stars. "Summon the inner circle," he commanded, when he finally emerged from his meditation 12 hours later. Around him, his most trusted advisors gathered with the silent efficiency that had made the First Legion legendary for their ability to operate in absolute secrecy. Grandmaster Holgin approached with the measured gait of a warrior who understood the weight of terrible news. "My lord, we have received fragmentary reports that seem to confirm your insights. Terra has gone dark. The Astronomicon has failed. There are reports of massive Chaos Fleet movements throughout the segmentum." The Lion studied the tactical displays with eyes that had seen the galaxy's darkest secrets. The Dark Angel's fleet was powerful, perhaps the most advanced spaceborne force remaining loyal to the Emperor's memory. But they were isolated, cut off from resupply and reinforcement by warp storms that seemed to actively conspire against rapid movement. "What is our strength?" he asked quietly. 47 vessels of the line, including 6 battle barges and the Invincible Reason herself, approximately 30,000 Astartes, plus support elements, full gene seed stores and manufacturing capabilities. Holgin paused, clearly reluctant to continue. "But my lord, without regular resupply from Mars and Terra, we will not need resupply where we are going," the Lion said with quiet finality. "Signal all captains. We begin the scouring." The inner circle exchanged glances that carried generations of shared secrets. The scouring was not a term that appeared in any official Imperial tactical doctrine. It was something older, darker, a protocol that the Dark Angels had developed during their earliest days, when they had served as the Emperor's personal agents in matters too sensitive for other legions to handle. The scouring meant total war against the enemies of humanity, conducted without mercy, without restraint, and without regard for collateral damage. It meant burning entire systems to deny them to the enemy. It meant hunting the traitors across the galaxy until every last one was dead, even if it took centuries. "My lord," Master Asmodai spoke, with the careful tone of someone who understood the implications of what was being discussed. The scouring protocols were designed for use against specific targets. To apply them galaxy-wide. "The galaxy has changed, Master," the Lion replied simply. "Our father is dead. Our brothers have fallen to chaos. The old rules no longer apply." He turned back to the tactical display, his pale eyes reflecting the light of distant stars. "We will hunt them all. Every traitor. Every heretic. Every world that has fallen to darkness. And we will burn them from existence so completely that even their names will be forgotten." On the hive world of Mordian, 3 sectors from Ultramar, the news of the Emperor's death arrived in the form of rioting that lasted for 18 hours and left 3 million dead. General Sturm, commander of the Mordian Iron Guard, stood on the command deck of the Planetary Defense Center and watched his world tear itself apart through civil unrest that had no clear cause or objective. "Sir," Colonel Dracus approached with a Vox transcript clutched in his augmetic hand. "We've received fragmentary communications from the Cadian Gate. Their astropaths are reporting massive Chaos Fleet movements in the Eye of Terra. Something called Operation Terminus, they think?" Sturm nodded grimly. Operation Terminus had been a theoretical contingency plan developed by Imperial strategists for the unlikely event of total institutional collapse. It called for local commanders to maintain order by any means necessary, while central authority was re-established. What it did not address was what to do when central authority had been conquered by the enemy. "Signal all regimental commanders," he commanded. "Martial law, full mobilization. Anyone caught spreading defeatist propaganda is to be executed immediately." But even as he gave the orders, Sturm knew they would not be enough. The Mordian Iron Guard was perhaps the finest regiment in this sector, but they were trained to fight external threats, not to suppress civilian unrest on the scale currently consuming their homeworld. The riots had started in the Underhive and were spreading upward through the city layers with viral intensity. Reports were coming in of PDF garrisons joining the rioters, of civilian administrators abandoning their posts, of entire hab blocks declaring independence from planetary authority. "Sir," Drakus said quietly, "there are reports of anomalous phenomena in hab sectors 7 through 15. Witnesses describe manifestations that are consistent with minor demonic incursion." The words hit Sturm like a physical blow. Demonic incursion on Mordian? The world had been a bastion of imperial loyalty for over 2 millennia. Its population was devoutly faithful, its military forces fanatically disciplined, its psycho detection protocols among the most rigorous in the Imperium. But if the Emperor was truly dead, if the psychic barriers that had protected humanity from the worst predations of the warp had fallen, "Implement Protocol Omega," Sturm said quietly. Protocol Omega was the absolute last resort, orbital bombardment of infected areas, followed by sterilization teams equipped with flamers and virus bombs. It was a protocol designed to prevent a single world from becoming a launching point for chaos invasion of an entire sector. Using it meant accepting that Mordian, as it had existed for 2,000 years, was already dead. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out on 1,000,000 different worlds. On Talan, the Desert Raiders found themselves fighting not just the Alpha Legion infiltrators who had been operating in their system for months, but also civilian uprisings that seemed to emerge from nowhere. On Catachan, the legendary jungle fighters discovered that their homeworld's predatory ecosystem had become even more dangerous as warp-touched mutations began appearing among the native fauna. On the Forge world of Lucius, Tecmagos Deltarian watched his carefully ordered domain descend into factional warfare as different sects of the Mechanicus chose different responses to the news of Terra's fall. Some called for immediate submission to the new reality. If Horus ruled the Imperium, then the Omnissiah's will must be served through him. Others declared that the Emperor's death meant the end of all previous obligations, leaving Mars free to pursue its own destiny among the stars. The fighting that erupted between these factions was brief but vicious, conducted with weapons that had been designed to fight alien empires rather than fellow servants of the machine god. When it ended, Lucius was divided between 3 separate enclaves, each claiming to represent the true will of the Omnissiah. Admiral Spire, commanding the Battlefleet Solar Reserve squadrons that had been stationed at the Fenris system during the siege, received word of Terra's fall through a message torpedo that had been launched by a dying astropath. The message was brief and fragmentary, but its import was clear. The Imperial Navy's home port was gone, its command structure was compromised, and every ship in the fleet was now operating without lawful orders. "Sir," Captain Voss of the battlecruiser Emperor's Will asked during the emergency command conference that followed, "What are our orders?" It was a simple question that contained layers of complexity that would have challenged the finest legal scholars in the Imperium. If the Emperor was dead and Terra had fallen, who possessed the authority to give orders to Imperial Navy vessels? If Horus claimed the throne, were they bound to obey him despite his apparent corruption? If they refused to acknowledge his authority, were they rebels against the lawful government or the last loyal remnant of a murdered state? "We maintain our patrol routes," Spire said finally. "We protect Imperial shipping. We engage hostile forces as identified, and we hope that somewhere in this madness, someone with legitimate authority survives to tell us what to do next." But even as he spoke, Spire knew that hope was likely to be disappointed. The galaxy was coming apart at the seams, and every ship, every world, every regiment was making its own choices about how to respond to the new reality. Some would choose loyalty to the Emperor's memory, even in death. Others would bend the knee to Horus and whatever he represented. Still others would strike out on their own, carving independent kingdoms from the wreckage of the greatest human civilization the galaxy had ever known. The Imperium of Man was dead. What would rise from its ashes remained to be seen. In the ruins of the Imperial Palace on Terra, Horus Lupercal sat on the golden throne and felt the pulse of a galaxy in chaos. Through the corrupted psychic networks that still functioned, he could sense the fear and confusion spreading from world to world as news of his victory reached the farthest corners of human space. Some worlds were falling into line already, their governors quick to recognize the new reality and eager to avoid the fate that had befallen Terra. Others were choosing defiance, rallying around local strongmen or clinging to the memory of the Emperor's light. Still others were simply dissolving into anarchy as their populations lost faith in any form of central authority. All of it pleased the beings that spoke through his mind. Chaos, after all, was not interested in efficient conquest. It fed on suffering, on uncertainty, on the slow dissolution of order into madness. A galaxy at war with itself was a galaxy that would provide endless sustenance for the ruinous powers. But there were two lights burning in the darkness that concerned him. Ultramar, where his brother Robute was building something that might become a rival power base, and the cold fire of vengeance that burned wherever Lionel Johnson walked, turning entire systems into graveyards in his systematic campaign against the traitor forces. Both would need to be dealt with, in time. But for now, Horus was content to let them burn their strength against the forces of entropy that were spreading across the galaxy like wildfire. Eventually, even they would tire. Eventually, even they would fall. The galaxy belonged to chaos now. The only question was how long it would take for everyone else to accept that fact. Chapter 9. Dark Age Rising. On the agri-world of Thessia Tertius, the harvest festivals had always been modest affairs, ceremonies of thanksgiving to the god emperor for another season's bounty, conducted in whitewashed chapels beneath portraits of the master of mankind in his golden glory. This year, the festivals burned with a different kind of fire. Cardinal Moravec stood at the edge of what had once been the shrine of the sacred harvest, and watched his world transform itself into something unrecognizable. The shrine's walls were still standing, but they had been painted over with symbols that hurt to look at directly. 8-pointed stars that seemed to twist and writhe when observed peripherally, words in languages that predated human speech, geometric patterns that suggested mathematical impossibilities. The congregation that knelt before the altar was still composed of the same farmers and agricultural workers who had attended his services for decades. But they were different now, changed in ways that went deeper than the physical mutations beginning to manifest among them. Their eyes held a light that belonged to no human faith. Their prayers were offered in harmonies that made reality itself shiver. "Tell me, Cardinal," the thing that had once been Governor Castell approached with footsteps that left brief flames in the ancient stones. "Does it trouble you to see your flock find new purpose?" Moravec did not turn to face the creature. 3 weeks ago, Castell had been an unremarkable planetary administrator, competent but uninspiring, faithful but not fanatical. The news of the Emperor's death had reached Thessia through fragmentary, astro-telepathic transmissions that painted a picture of cosmic catastrophe. Within days, something had begun whispering to the governor in his dreams. Within a week, he had announced that a new god sat upon the golden throne. Now Castell's skin bore the texture of parchment that had been written on too many times. His eyes burned with inner fire, and his voice carried harmonics that spoke of powers beyond mortal comprehension. "I see my flock being consumed by parasites," Moravec replied quietly. "I see souls that were meant for the Emperor's light being dragged into darkness by beings that exist only to spread suffering." Castell laughed, and it was the sound of prayers being burned. "The Emperor is dead, old man. We felt him die. Every psyker on this world screamed when his light went out. But death is not the end. Death is transformation." He gestured toward the congregation, where the harvest hymns had become something that belonged in no human throat. "They understand what you refuse to accept. The galaxy has changed. The old gods have revealed themselves as the lies they always were. Only chaos offers truth." The Cardinal finally turned, and Castell stepped back involuntarily at the absolute conviction in the old man's eyes. "I have served the Emperor for 70 years, Moravec said simply. "I have seen his miracles, felt his presence, witnessed the power of faith made manifest. His death does not diminish what he was. It does not justify what you have become." "Then you are a fool," Castell replied, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "And when the Scourge ships come to claim this world for the new Imperium, your stubborn faith will not protect you. The Scourge ships. The rumors had been spreading across the sector for days, vast vessels painted in the colors of chaos, crewed by things that had once been human, seeking out worlds that had not yet acknowledged the new reality. Some planets submitted immediately when the ships arrived, their populations eager to embrace whatever would spare them from the fate that had befallen Terra. Others resisted and were reduced to ash and bone within hours. But a few, a precious few, chose a third path. On the forge world of Lucius, Fabricator General Kane stood in the heart of the planet's primary manufactorum and felt the weight of 10,000 years of tradition pressing against the necessity of impossible choice. Around him, the greatest tech priests of Mars had gathered in emergency conclave, their mechanical forms casting strange shadows in the light of plasma furnaces that had burned since the dark age of technology. The debate had been raging for 18 hours without pause, conducted in the rapid-fire binary cant that allowed for the exchange of complex theological and logical arguments at superhuman speed. But the core question remained simple and terrible. With the Emperor dead and Horus claiming dominion over humanity, what was the proper response of the Adeptus Mechanicus? "The Omnissiah is dead," Magos Dominus Zerath's synthesized voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "The Treaty of Mars bound us to serve him in exchange for autonomy and resources. With his death, that compact is null. We owe nothing to the pretender who has claimed his throne." "The Omnissiah transcends mortal flesh," Tec Dominus Helix replied with mechanical precision. "His physical form may have been destroyed, but his knowledge, his vision, his sacred design for human evolution, these things cannot die. We remain bound by our oaths, regardless of who sits upon the golden throne." Kane processed their arguments through cogitators that had been enhanced beyond baseline human comprehension, but logic alone could not resolve the fundamental contradiction at the heart of their dilemma. The Mechanicus existed in a delicate balance between independence and integration with the broader Imperium. Too much independence, and they risked being seen as a rival power that needed to be suppressed. Too much integration, and they lost the autonomy that allowed them to pursue the sacred quest for knowledge without imperial interference. now that balance had been shattered, and every choice carried risks that could destroy the organization he had spent centuries building. "There is another option," Magos biologist Cowell spoke, with the careful cadence of someone proposing something that bordered on heresy. "We have received transmissions from Ultramar. Lord Guilliman has declared independence from the Central Imperium and is establishing what he calls the Imperium Secundus. If we were to ally ourselves with his cause—" The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and danger. Guilliman's declaration had reached Mars through the same fragmentary astro-telepathic networks that carried news of Terra's fall. The Primarch was offering a vision of the future that preserved imperial ideals while acknowledging the reality of the central government's collapse. But it would mean choosing sides in a civil war whose outcome was far from certain. "Lord Guilliman lacks the authority to make such promises," Zerath objected. "He is not the Emperor. He cannot speak for the Omnissiah's will." "Can Horus?" Cain asked quietly. The question hung in the recycled air like an accusation. The War Master serves powers that are antithetical to everything the Omnissiah represented. Knowledge perverted into mutation. Logic corrupted by passion. The sacred quest for understanding replaced by worship of entropy itself. The conclave fell silent as the implications settled into their enhanced cognitive matrices. Serving Horus meant accepting that their millennia-long partnership with humanity would be redefined according to the whims of beings that existed only to spread chaos and decay. Serving Guilliman meant betting their future on a single Primarch's ability to restore order to a galaxy gone mad. Independence meant facing both options as enemies. In the end, the decision was made not through debate, but through necessity. Word arrived that a Chaos fleet had translated into the outer system, broadcasting demands for Mars's immediate submission to the new Imperium. The ships bore the heraldry of the Iron Warriors and the Word-Bearers, legions that had once fought alongside the Mechanicus in the name of human progress. Now they had come to claim Mars for powers that viewed technology as nothing more than another tool for spreading corruption. Cain gave the order that would echo through the ages. All orbital platforms, engage hostile forces. Signal Ultramar. Mars declares for the Imperium Secundus. May the Omnissiah preserve us all. The battle that followed lasted for 6 days, and left the void around Mars littered with the debris of ships that had once been symbols of human achievement. The Forge world's defenses held, but at a cost that would take decades to repair. More importantly, the die had been cast. Mars would stand with Guilliman, whatever the consequences. 1,000 light-years away, in the private chambers of Navigator House Belisarius, Novator Zerathis studied stellar charts that had become exercises in futility. The ancient bloodline of psychically gifted humans had guided Imperial ships through the warp for millennia, using the light of the Astronomicon as a fixed reference point in the chaotic currents of the Empyrean. Without that light, navigation had become guesswork. "How many ships have we lost this week?" she asked her chief astrogator, a grizzled void sailor whose family had served House Belisarius for 15 generations. 7 confirmed, my lady. 3 more are overdue and presumed lost. The warp currents are unpredictable without the Emperor's light to guide them. Unpredictable was a gross understatement. The warp had always been dangerous, but the Astronomicon had provided stability, a lighthouse that allowed skilled navigators to plot courses through the storm. Without it, every journey became a desperate gamble against forces that existed outside the normal flow of space and time. Some navigator houses were adapting by limiting their operations to short-range jumps, hopping from system to system rather than attempting the long-range translations that had been routine during the height of imperial power. Others were experimenting with alternative navigation techniques, psychic beacons established by other navigators, stellar phenomena that remained stable even in the warp, ancient pre-imperial technologies that had guided humanity's first ventures into the void. But all of these solutions were stopgaps, temporary measures that could not replace the cosmic infrastructure that had died with the Emperor. The age of easy interstellar travel was ending, and with it, the unity that had held the Imperium together. "Signal the other houses," Zerathis commanded. "Emergency conclave. We need to coordinate our responses before we all die, alone in the dark." On the death world of Krieg, Chapter Master Azrael of the Dark Vengeance, a Space Marine chapter that had been founded during the later years of the Great Crusade, stood before his assembled battle brothers and delivered the words that would transform them from servants of a dead empire into rulers of their own destiny. "The Emperor is dead," he said simply. "Terra has fallen. The Imperium we swore to serve no longer exists." Around him, 500 Astartes warriors listened in absolute silence, their enhanced minds processing the implications of what their commander was telling them. "We have a choice to make. We can spend our strength trying to restore something that is gone forever. We can kneel before the pretender who has claimed our father's throne, or we can carve out our own domain and preserve what we can of the imperial ideal." The choice was not unique to the Dark Vengeance. Across the galaxy, Space Marine chapters were facing the same impossible decision. Some remained loyal to the memory of the Emperor, and threw their lot in with Guilliman's Imperium Secundus. Others declared independence, becoming warlords who ruled through strength and claimed legitimacy through their genetic heritage. A few, too few, chose to continue their original mission of protecting humanity, regardless of political considerations. "We claim the Krieg system and all inhabited worlds within 20 light-years," Azrael continued. "We rule not as conquerors, but as protectors. We preserve the imperial ideal through our actions, not our allegiance. And we prepare for the day when humanity has need of heroes again." The transformation was gradual, but inexorable. Within weeks, the Dark Vengeance had established themselves as the de facto government of 7 inhabited worlds, their word backed by the might of Space Marine arms and the desperate gratitude of populations that had been abandoned by every other authority. They were not the only ones. Chapter Master Kalos of the Iron Skulls declared dominion over the Medusa sector. The Steel Dragons claimed sovereignty over their homeworld and its 3 neighboring systems. The Crimson Fists announced the formation of the Rin's World Protectorate, dedicated to preserving human civilization against the forces of chaos. Each decision created ripples that spread outward through local space. Planetary governors who had once answered to distant Terra now found themselves negotiating with Space Marine warlords who possessed the power to enforce their will, but lacked the infrastructure to govern effectively. Trade routes that had operated under Imperial Charter for centuries were disrupted as different factions claimed control over various systems. The galaxy was fragmenting, but it was also adapting. On 100,000 worlds, populations that had relied on Imperial technology for basic necessities began to rediscover older ways of doing things. Agri-worlds turned to manual labor as their automated systems failed without regular maintenance from Mars. Hive cities began restricting access to the upper levels as their climate control systems became unreliable. Void ships constructed using standard template construction methods were retrofitted with simpler, more maintainable systems that could be repaired by local engineers. It was not a return to the dark age of technology, but it was a significant step backward from the heights of human achievement that the Imperium had represented. Knowledge was being lost as scholars died and libraries burned. Techniques that had taken centuries to perfect were being forgotten, as the apprentices, who should have carried them forward, fled or died in the chaos. But it was also a time of innovation, as human communities adapted to their new circumstances with the ingenuity that had lifted them from Terra's surface to rule among the stars. New technologies emerged from the necessity of independence. Old knowledge was rediscovered in forgotten archives. Alternative approaches to problems that had been standardized across the Imperium began to emerge as different worlds found their own solutions. The age of unity was ending, but the age of diversity was beginning. Whether that would prove to be humanity's salvation or its doom remained to be seen. From his throne on Terra, Horus Lupercal felt the pulse of a galaxy transforming itself according to the whims of necessity and ambition. Through the corrupted psychic networks that still connected him to distant worlds, he could sense the fear and uncertainty that drove billions of humans to make choices they had never imagined they would face. Some chose submission, and their worlds became festering gardens where chaos could cultivate new forms of corruption. Others chose defiance, and their resistance would eventually be ground down by forces they could not comprehend or oppose. Still others chose paths that led neither to his throne nor to outright rebellion, and these were perhaps the most interesting of all. The galaxy was fracturing along lines that would reshape the very nature of human civilization. New powers were rising, old alliances were dissolving, and the monolithic structure that had defined the Imperium for 2 centuries was giving way to something far more complex and chaotic. It was exactly what the ruinous powers had wanted all along. Order was the enemy of chaos. Unity was the enemy of entropy. The Imperium's greatest strength had been its ability to coordinate the efforts of 1,000,000 worlds toward common goals. With that coordination shattered, humanity would tear itself apart through competition and conflict, providing endless sustenance for beings that fed on strife and despair. The Emperor had understood this, which was why he had worked so hard to maintain the unity that held human civilization together. But the Emperor was dead, and his vision of an ordered future had died with him. What remained was the slow dissolution of everything he had built, and the rise of powers that would ensure humanity never again posed a threat to the fundamental chaos that lay at the heart of existence. The galaxy burned, and in its burning, new things were being born. Chapter 10. Ultramar's Gambit. The fortress of Hera had stood sentinel over Macragga for 8,000 years, its adamantine walls bearing witness to the rise and fall of civilizations that existed before humanity learned to split the atom. Now, in the vast ceremonial chamber at its heart, Robert Guilliman prepared to do something that would have been unthinkable mere weeks ago: declare himself the rightful heir to his father's empire. The assembly that had gathered before him represented the scattered remnants of imperial authority, governors who had fled their worlds when chaos cults rose up, naval commanders whose fleets had nowhere safe to dock, space marine captains whose chapters had been scattered by the galaxy-wide catastrophe. They came seeking leadership, direction, some sign that the dream of human unity could survive the nightmare that had consumed Terra. Guilliman stood before them in the full regalia of a Primarch, but the weight of kingship sat uneasily on his shoulders. He had never wanted to rule an empire. His talents lay in organization, in logistics, in the careful coordination of resources toward common goals. But want had become irrelevant the moment his father died and left humanity orphaned among the stars. "Fellow servants of the imperial ideal," he began, his voice carrying easily through the vast chamber, despite the acoustics that had been designed for councils of thousands rather than this desperate gathering of hundreds. "We convene today, not to mourn what we have lost, but to preserve what can yet be saved." The silence that followed carried the weight of desperate hope. These people had traveled across half the galaxy to reach Ultramar, fleeing worlds that had fallen to chaos or descended into anarchy. They represented perhaps 100th of the Imperium's former population, but they were all that remained of humanity's greatest dream. "The Emperor is dead," Guilliman continued, and the words still felt like blasphemy even as he spoke them. "Terra has fallen to the ruinous powers. The Astronomicon is dark. The galaxy burns with civil war and heresy." He paused, letting the magnitude of the disaster settle into their consciousness. "But we are not dead. The ideals for which the Emperor fought are not dead. The hope of human greatness is not dead." Captain Sicarius, standing at attention near the chamber's entrance, watched the faces of the assembled representatives as Guilliman's words reached them. Some showed relief. Finally, someone with the authority and resources to offer genuine leadership. Others displayed skepticism. Could even a Primarch restore order to the chaos that had consumed their galaxy? Still others bore expressions of desperate faith, clinging to Guilliman's words as the last anchor in a universe gone mad. "I formally declare the establishment of the Imperium Secundus," Guilliman announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. 500 worlds united under the principles my father established, but governed according to the realities we now face. We will be a beacon of hope in the darkness. We will preserve human knowledge and culture against the forces that seek to destroy them, and we will prepare for the day when humanity can reclaim its birthright among the stars. The applause that followed was thunderous, but also strangely hollow. Everyone present understood what Guilliman was really saying, that the old Imperium was gone forever, that what he offered was not restoration, but consolation, a pale shadow of what humanity had once achieved, but perhaps the best that could be managed under the circumstances. 3 days later, in the orbital shipyards above Macraga, Fleet Admiral Titus examined reports that spoke of both hope and desperation in equal measure. Since Guilliman's declaration, ships had been arriving in the Ultramar system on a daily basis, Imperial Navy vessels whose crews had chosen loyalty to the Imperium's ideals over submission to Horus's corrupted regime, Space Marine battle barges carrying chapters that had declared for the Secundus, merchant vessels laden with refugees, and what remained of their homeworld's treasures. But the numbers told a sobering story. Current fleet strength stands at 217 vessels of the line, Captain Voss reported with the clinical precision that had made him invaluable during the siege of Calth. Approximately 60,000 naval personnel, including support crews. Space Marine strength is harder to quantify. 17 chapters have declared for the Secundus, but most are operating at significantly reduced strength. Admiral Titus nodded grimly. Before the heresy, the Imperial Navy had numbered in the hundreds of thousands of vessels. The Space Marines had comprised 20 legions, each with its own fleet and support structure. What Guilliman commanded now was impressive by any reasonable standard, but it was a fraction of what the Emperor had once wielded. "What of industrial capacity?" Titus asked. "Better news there, sir. The shipyards of Ultramar were among the most advanced in Imperial space. With the refugees from Mars and other Forge worlds, we estimate we can maintain current fleet strength and even expand modestly." "But, sir—" Voss paused, clearly reluctant to continue. "The resource situation is more complex. We're receiving loyalty oaths from systems across several sectors, but actual resource extraction and to transport are challenging. The problem was one that plagued every aspect of the Imperium Secundus. Without the Astronomicon, interstellar travel had become a dangerous gamble. Ships that would once have made routine supply runs now faced the possibility of being lost in warp storms or emerging from translation to find themselves centuries off course. Trade routes that had operated reliably for millennia had simply stopped functioning. In the depths of Macraga's polar fortress, Chief Librarian Tegurius knelt in meditation before an array of psychic amplification devices that represented months of desperate innovation. The Ultramarines had never possessed psychers of the magnitude necessary to replace the Astronomicon. That had been a function requiring the Emperor's unique abilities, supplemented by the sacrifice of thousands of souls daily. But perhaps they could create something smaller, more limited. A beacon that could guide ships across the 500 worlds, a network of psychic lighthouses that might restore some semblance of reliable communication and transport to the Secundus. How goes the experiment? Guilliman's voice carried a note of carefully controlled hope as he entered the meditation chamber. The Primarch had been pushing his scholars and tech priests to find solutions to problems that had never been intended to have solutions. Slowly, my lord, Tegurius replied without opening his eyes. The Chief Librarian's features were marked by the strain of channeling psychic energies far beyond his natural capacity. We have achieved limited success with short-range beacons, perhaps 5 light-years at maximum range. But the power requirements— He paused, gathering his thoughts. To create a network that could serve even Ultramar's core systems would require 100 psychers of my level, working in constant rotation. Guilliman felt something cold settle in his chest. Ultramar possessed perhaps a dozen psychers of Tegurius's caliber. The refugees from other worlds had brought their own libraries and scholars, but replacing the Emperor's divine presence was proving to be a task beyond mortal capability. Continue the work, he commanded. Even limited success would be invaluable. But privately, he began to understand the true scope of the catastrophe that had befallen humanity. The Emperor's death had not simply removed a leader. It had removed an irreplaceable component of the infrastructure that held human civilization together. 700 light-years from Macraga in the Mordian system, the civil war that was consuming the galaxy played out on a smaller but no less vicious scale. General Storm had managed to restore order to his homeworld through the application of overwhelming force and martial law that would have been unthinkable under normal imperial governance. But order was a relative term when chaos cults emerged in new districts every week, and demonic manifestations required constant vigilance to suppress. Sir, Colonel Dracus approached with the weary gait of an officer who had not slept properly in weeks. We've received transmissions from the Ultramar system. Lord Guilliman is calling for all loyal Imperial forces to rally to his banner. He's offering sanctuary and resources to any world that declares for what he's calling the Imperium Secundus. Sturm studied the message transcript with eyes that had seen too much in the week since Terra's fall. Guilliman's offer was generous: protection, trade agreements, military support for any world that acknowledged the legitimacy of his new government. But it was also an admission that the galaxy would never again be united under a single authority. What are our options? He asked, though he already knew the answer. 3, sir. We can declare for Horus and hope that submission buys us mercy. We can attempt to maintain independence and face whatever comes alone. Or we can throw our lot in with Lord Guilliman and hope that his Secundus can become something resembling the old Imperium. The choice was no choice at all. Horus served powers that viewed human suffering as entertainment. Independence was a slow death sentence for a world that lacked the resources to defend itself against the forces now loose in the galaxy. Guilliman, whatever his limitations, at least offered the possibility of preserving something worth preserving. Signal Macraga, Sturm commanded. Mordian declares for the Imperium Secundus. Request immediate assistance with our local difficulties. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out as planetary governors and military commanders faced the same impossible choice. Some worlds declared for Guilliman and sent what resources they could to support his growing confederation. Others chose submission to Horus or attempted to maintain their independence. Most simply fell into chaos as their populations turned on each other in conflicts that served no purpose beyond spreading misery. The galaxy was dividing itself along lines that would reshape human civilization for millennia to come. In his private study aboard the Macragge's Honor, Guilliman stood before a holographic display that showed the current political situation across known space. Red markers indicated worlds that had fallen to chaos. Green showed systems that had declared for the Secundus. Yellow marked worlds that claimed independence, but remained potentially reachable. Grey indicated systems from which no communication had been received at all. The display was mostly grey, with scattered patches of red and even smaller islands of green. Here and there, yellow markers indicated worlds that were still fighting or attempting to chart their own course. The Emperor's 1,000,000 worlds had been reduced to perhaps 10,000 that could still be said to function as organized political entities. It was the greatest disaster in human history. "My lord," Captain Ventress entered with a data slate containing the latest reports from across the Secundus. "Resource allocation summaries for the week. We're receiving loyalty declarations from an average of 3 systems daily, but actual resource transfers are down to perhaps 1/3 of our projected needs." Guilliman nodded without taking his eyes from the display. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. The Imperium Secundus could function as long as its member worlds remained productive and relatively peaceful, but every world that joined them also brought its own problems: refugee populations, damaged infrastructure, military forces that needed to be fed and equipped. They were building a new nation from the fragments of a dead empire, using resources that were never quite adequate and facing threats that grew stronger with each passing day. "What news from the frontier?" he asked. "The Boros system has gone silent. Their last transmission spoke of ships that eat light approaching from the galactic rim. The Thrakan sector is reporting mass civilian unrest following rumors that their planetary governor has been replaced by a daemon. And, sir..." Ventress paused, clearly reluctant to continue. "We've detected what appear to be word-bearer reconnaissance probes in 3 systems on our outer perimeter." Guilliman finally turned from the display, his patrician features marked by a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. The word-bearers were Lorgar's sons, masters of corruption and subversion. Their presence meant that Horus had taken notice of the Imperium Secundus and was beginning to plan its destruction. "Double the frontier patrols," he commanded. "Begin evacuation planning for the outer systems, and signal Mars. We need to accelerate production of everything. Ships, weapons, defensive installations, whatever they can build." But even as he gave the orders, Guilliman knew they were insufficient. The Imperium Secundus was growing stronger, but so were its enemies. Horus commanded the resources of Terra and the loyalty of half the galaxy's space marine legions. The ruinous powers themselves supported his cause, providing reinforcements that defied every law of physics and logistics. In the end, the Secundus might simply be delaying the inevitable, preserving human civilization for a few more years or decades before the darkness claimed it entirely. That night, alone in his chambers, Robert Guilliman allowed himself to confront the truth he had been avoiding since the moment he learned of his father's death. The Imperium of Man, the golden dream of a galaxy united under human rule, was gone forever. What he was building was not a restoration, but a replacement, a smaller and more fragile thing that might preserve some portion of human achievement against the forces of chaos and entropy. It was not what the Emperor had envisioned. It was not what any of them had fought to achieve during the Great Crusade. But it was what remained possible in a universe that had proven far more hostile to human ambitions than any of them had dared imagine. The old Imperium was dead. The Imperium Secundus would have to be enough. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. Chapter 11. The Demon Emperor. The Golden Throne no longer resembled the masterwork of human engineering that had once guided the species through its greatest age. Over the weeks since Horus had claimed it, the ancient device had been transformed into something that belonged in no sane universe. Brass spikes erupted from its armrests, their surfaces slick with blood that never seemed to dry. Crystalline growths pulsed with impossible colors along its base, each pulse accompanied by whispers in languages that predated human speech. The very air around it shimmered with energies that made reality itself recoil. And at its heart sat the thing that had once been Horus Lupercal, War Master of the Emperor's armies, beloved son of humanity's greatest leader. What remained of Horus's original form was difficult to perceive directly. The four chaos gods had taken residence within his flesh, reshaping it according to their conflicting desires. Khorne's influence manifested as brass armor that had fused with his skin, its surface decorated with the skulls of every loyal warrior who had fallen defending Terra. Tzeentch's touch showed in the way his flesh shifted and changed from moment to moment, never quite maintaining the same configuration. Nurgle's blessing appeared as patches of corruption that bloomed across his frame like diseased flowers, each one a perfect specimen of entropy made manifest. And Slanesh's gift was visible in the terrible beauty that somehow unified all these contradictions into something that was magnificent and horrifying in equal measure. When he spoke, it was with voices that had shaped the universe itself since its birth. "Bring me the morning reports," the Demon Emperor commanded, and the word-bearers who served as his administrators prostrated themselves before approaching the throne. These were no longer the proud Astartes who had once served the Emperor's vision of human unity. Weeks of exposure to their new master's presence had changed them into something between Space Marine and demon, their power armor fused with flesh that bore mutations too complex for mortal minds to fully comprehend. Their eyes burned with the fires of the warp, and their voices carried harmonics that made the air itself bleed. "My lord," Dark Apostle Erebus spoke with vocal cords that had been rewoven according to principles of sacred geometry, "the population of Terra continues its transition. Approximately 60% of the surviving civilians now bear the mark of your blessing. The remainder show signs of spiritual evolution that will require additional time to reach fruition." The words were euphemisms that barely concealed the horror of what they described. In the 6 weeks since Horus had claimed Terra, the planet's population had become a laboratory for the most extreme forms of chaos corruption. Demonic possession had become commonplace, with minor warp entities inhabiting the bodies of clerks and factory workers who had once lived lives of quiet devotion. Mutation was not just accepted, but encouraged, with citizens competing to display the most elaborate signs of their new god's favor. The imperial palace itself had become the epicenter of this transformation. Its ancient corridors, once filled with the quiet bustle of administration, now echoed with sounds that belonged in no human structure. Laughter that came from throats reshaped by impossible geometries. Prayers offered in languages that existed only in fever dreams. Music played on instruments, crafted from materials that defied identification. "What of the traitor legions?" Horus asked, his attention shifting to an Iron Warriors captain whose face had been replaced with a mechanical construct that bore too many eyes. "The transformation proceeds according to your will, my lord," the captain replied through speakers that distorted his voice into frequencies that made the walls vibrate. "The Legion strength reports are complex to quantify in traditional terms. The distinction between Astartes and demon is becoming less relevant as your blessing spreads among the ranks." This was perhaps the most profound change that had occurred since Horus claimed the throne. The traitor legions that had fought the Civil War as recognizable Space Marine forces were evolving into something entirely new. Exposure to concentrated chaos energy was remaking them at the genetic level, turning them into beings that retained their tactical knowledge and military discipline, but possessed capabilities that defied every law of physics. The Iron Warriors were becoming living siege engines, their flesh replaced with mechanisms that could breach any fortification. The word-bearers had transformed into conduits for demonic power, able to summon warp entities through will alone. The Death Guard had embraced entropy so completely that they could spread plague and decay through their mere presence. The Emperor's children pursued sensation so extreme that their every action became a form of art that drove observers to madness. "Show me the webway," Horus commanded, rising from the throne with movements that left brief tears in local space-time. The procession that followed him deeper into the palace would have been impossible to describe to anyone who had not witnessed the transformation of Terra firsthand. Dark apostles, whose prayer books were bound in living flesh, led the way, chanting hymns that made reality more malleable. Iron warriors, whose weaponry had fused with their bodies, provided security against threats that might emerge from the spaces between dimensions. Emperor's children, whose mutations had become works of terrible art, documented the journey through means that had nothing to do with conventional recording technology. The chamber that had once housed the Imperial Webway Gate was now something that challenged every assumption about architecture and physics. The walls curved in directions that should not have existed. The ceiling showed views of alien stars that burned with colors that had no names. And at the chamber's center, where Malkador the Sigillite had died trying to seal the breach in reality, a permanent portal to the warp yawned like a wound that would never heal. Through that portal, demons poured in an endless stream. Not the minor entities that had previously leaked through microfractures in reality, but greater demons whose presence in the material universe should have been impossible. Bloodthirsters of Khorne stalked the palace corridors, their brass armor gleaming with reflected firelight. Lords of Change drifted through chambers where they whispered secrets that remade whoever heard them. Great unclean ones spread their gifts of decay through populations that welcomed disease as a form of blessing. Keepers of secrets transformed entire districts into playgrounds where pleasure and pain became indistinguishable. "It is beautiful," Horus said, as he observed the parade of horrors flowing from the warp into reality. Father tried so hard to keep them out. He never understood that they were not invaders. They were potential. The future he was too frightened to embrace. The irony was not lost on him. The Emperor had worked for millennia to protect humanity from exactly this kind of corruption. The Great Crusade, the Imperial Truth, the careful suppression of knowledge about the warp, all of it had been designed to prevent human civilization from falling under the influence of the Chaos Gods. But the Emperor's death had removed the only force capable of maintaining those barriers. Now Terra itself was becoming a demon world, a place where the laws of physics bent to accommodate the whims of entities that existed beyond mortal comprehension. In the hive districts that sprawled across Terra's scarred surface, the transformation was proceeding with viral efficiency. Citizens who had once prayed to the god emperor now offered their devotions to beings that answered their prayers in ways that exceeded their wildest imagination and their worst nightmares. Sister Agatha of the Order of the Sacred Rose had spent 40 years ministering to the spiritual needs of Hive Tertius's population. She had comforted the dying, blessed newborn children, and maintained the faith even in the darkest hours of human suffering. Now she knelt before an altar that had been crafted from materials that pulse with their own inner light, offering prayers to a god who had proven far more responsive than the distant emperor had ever been. The changes in her body were gradual but undeniable. Her skin had taken on a luminescence that made her beautiful in ways that human genetics had never allowed. Her voice carried harmonics that could bring tears of joy or despair to anyone who heard it. Her prayers were answered with miracles that made the faithful weep with gratitude and terror in equal measure. But the price was becoming clear. Each blessing came with a cost that was not immediately apparent, but accumulated over time. The children she blessed developed mutations that were beautiful to behold, but removed them further from anything recognizably human. The sick she healed found their afflictions replaced with new forms of suffering that were somehow more perfect than mere disease. The faithful who received her guidance began to hunger for experiences that led them ever further from the paths of conventional morality. "Do you regret it?" the voice asked from the shadows behind the altar. She knew that voice, had heard it first in dreams that felt more real than waking life, then in moments of prayer when her faith burned brightest. Now it spoke to her directly, without need for the intermediary of sleep or meditation. "How can I regret truth?" she replied, though part of her, the part that remembered 40 years of service to a distant god, whispered that this was not truth but seduction. "You have shown me wonders that the emperor never offered. You have answered prayers that he ignored. And yet something in your mortal shell resists. Something clings to the old certainties, even as your consciousness expands to encompass new possibilities." It was true. Despite the obvious benefits of her transformation, despite the tangible proof of her new patron's power, Sister Agatha felt a resistance deep in her core, a stubborn attachment to values and beliefs that seemed increasingly irrelevant in the face of transcendent experience. "The resistance will fade," the voice assured her, with tones that conveyed infinite patience. "It always does. Mortals cling to their limitations because they fear the alternatives. But once they taste true freedom, true possibility, the old constraints become unbearable." Across Terra, variations of this conversation played out in millions of different contexts. Planetary Defense Force officers who had sworn oaths of loyalty to the Emperor found themselves leading units that were no longer bound by conventional military doctrine. Tech priests who had served the Omnissiah discovered that their new masters offered knowledge that made their previous understanding seem primitive. Administrators who had once maintained the complex bureaucracy that governed human civilization now served as intermediaries between mortal populations and entities that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. The transformation was not violent in the conventional sense. There were no mass executions, no systematic persecution of those who resisted. Instead, the changes spread through a combination of seduction and inevitability. Those who embraced the new reality found themselves rewarded with power and knowledge beyond their previous imagination. Those who resisted found their resistance gradually worn away by the obvious benefits that surrounded them. In his study aboard the command ship Vengeful Spirit, now permanently docked at Terra's primary orbital platform, Ezekiel Abaddon reviewed reports that would have been incomprehensible to the warriors he had commanded during the early stages of the heresy. The first captain of the Sons of Horus, now styling himself the War Master's heir apparent, had undergone his own transformation in the weeks since Terra's fall. His body retained the basic configuration of a space marine, but the enhancements went far beyond anything that had been achieved through conventional gene seed manipulation. His strength was no longer merely superhuman, but bordered on the supernatural. His tactical awareness had expanded to encompass possibilities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. His weapons had been reforged using techniques that combined advanced metallurgy with principles of warp manipulation, creating implements that could cut through reality itself when properly employed. "Status report," he commanded the assembled captains, and their responses came in a mixture of Gothic and languages that had never been spoken by human mouths. "The Terran pacification is 93% complete," reported Captain Loken, though the thing that wore Loken's name and bore his memories was only tangentially related to the warrior who had once been Abaddon's closest friend. Resistance cells continue to operate in the deep hive levels and the polar ice caps, but their activities are more symbolic than militarily significant. "The orbital defenses have been reconfigured according to the new paradigm," added another captain, whose form shifted subtly as he spoke, never quite maintaining the same appearance for more than a few seconds. "We can now project force across several light years using principles that exceed traditional physics." Abaddon nodded, processing information that arrived in his consciousness through channels that had nothing to do with conventional sensory input. Terra had become more than just another conquered world. It was evolving into something that could serve as the foundation for an empire that would make the old Imperium look primitive by comparison. But the reports also contained warnings. Guilliman's Imperium Secundus was growing stronger, attracting loyalty from worlds that might otherwise have submitted to the new reality. The Lion's campaign of vengeance was disrupting supply lines and communication networks across several sectors. Other Primarchs remained unaccounted for, their potential for resistance unknown but troubling. "What are the War Master's instructions regarding our brothers?" Abaddon asked. "Patience," came the reply, though it was unclear which of the assembled captains had spoken. "The galaxy is transforming itself according to patterns that serve our purposes. Unity was the enemy of chaos. Division serves our needs. Let them build their little kingdoms and fight their little wars. In time they will exhaust themselves, and we will harvest whatever remains." It was a strategy that relied on the fundamental weakness of mortal ambition, the tendency of human organizations to fragment under pressure, to pursue short-term goals at the expense of long-term stability. Horus had learned this lesson from his father, though he intended to apply it in ways the Emperor had never contemplated. The old Imperium had survived through unity imposed from above, maintained by the Emperor's will, and enforced by the threat of overwhelming military intervention. But that unity had always been artificial, held together by shared fear of external threats and internal dissolution. Now that the external threat was gone and the center had collapsed, human nature was asserting itself. The scattered remnants of imperial civilization were creating their own power structures, pursuing their own goals, competing for resources that were no longer abundant enough to support the grand vision of galactic unity. Eventually, those competitions would become conflicts. The conflicts would become wars. The wars would weaken all participants until none possessed the strength to resist when the true masters of the galaxy decided to expand their dominion beyond Terra. From his throne in the heart of the transformed imperial palace, Horus felt the pulse of 1,000,000 worlds, where human populations struggled to adapt to a universe that no longer offered the certainties their species had enjoyed for 2 centuries. Some would find new forms of order. Others would descend into anarchy. Still others would discover patrons who offered stability in exchange for worship and service. All of it served the purposes of the ruinous powers who fed on the raw emotional energy generated by struggle, ambition, despair, and ecstasy. The galaxy was becoming a more nourishing place with each passing day, and that nourishment would fuel the next phase of their eternal war against the forces of stagnation and false order. The Demon Emperor smiled with faces that belonged to no single species, and reality shivered in response. Chapter 12. What remains? 100 years had passed since the Emperor died, and the galaxy still bore the scars. Captain Thaddeus Ventris of the Ultramarines stood on the observation deck of the battle barge Courage of Calth and watched the stars that marked the boundary between hope and despair. Behind him lay the 500 worlds of Ultramar, humanity's last great stronghold, a beacon of imperial ideals preserved against impossible odds. Ahead stretched the void that separated Guilliman's domain from the rest of the galaxy, a buffer zone maintained through constant vigilance and the sacrifice of countless lives. The young captain, though at 90 years old, few outside of the Astartes would consider him young, had never known the galaxy as it existed during the Great Crusade. His earliest memories were of evacuation transports, fleeing burning worlds, of desperate defensive actions against enemies that defied comprehension, of supply convoys that vanished into warp storms and were never seen again. To him, the scattered islands of human civilization were not a fallen empire, but simply the way things were. Signal from Fleet Command. Sergeant Pausanias approached with the measured gait of a warrior who had seen too many battles across too many years. Lord Guilliman requests your presence in the Strategium. Priority Alpha. Ventris nodded and made his way through corridors that bore the accumulated honors of a century of constant warfare. Battle banners hung from the vaulted ceilings, each one representing a successful defense of some human enclave or the successful evacuation of populations from worlds that could no longer be held. It was an impressive display of military achievement, but it was also a catalogue of strategic retreats and tactical withdrawals that told the story of a defensive war that showed no signs of ending. The Strategium of the Courage of Calth had been redesigned according to the realities of commanding a civilization under siege. Where once imperial commanders had planned grand offensives across multiple sectors, Ultramar's military leadership focused on resource allocation, refugee management, and the careful husbanding of strength that could not be replaced. The great holographic displays that filled the chamber showed not conquest, but preservation. Trade routes that needed protection, border worlds that required reinforcement, and the constant calculations of how long current supply levels could sustain the war effort. Robert Guilliman stood at the center of it all, and Ventris was struck by how much his gene father had aged in the century since Terra's fall. Not physically, the Primarch's enhanced physiology showed no signs of deterioration, but in ways that went deeper than flesh and bone. His eyes carried the weight of countless difficult decisions, the burden of maintaining hope in circumstances that offered precious little cause for optimism. "Captain," Guilliman's voice retained its authority, but there was an underlying weariness that spoke of battles fought not just against external enemies, but against the gradual erosion of everything he had worked to build. "I have a mission for you. Long-range reconnaissance to the Cadia system. We need current intelligence on Horus's activities in the Eye of Terra." The Eye of Terra. Even the name carried weight that made reality itself shiver. What had once been a relatively stable warp anomaly on the galaxy's northwestern edge had expanded dramatically in the century since Horus claimed the Golden Throne. Now it covered nearly an eighth of the galaxy's area, a vast realm where the laws of physics bent to accommodate the whims of beings that existed beyond mortal comprehension. "My lord," Ventress said carefully, "our last reconnaissance mission to that sector was unsuccessful. Captain Uriel's entire task force vanished without trace. That was 18 months ago." "I am aware of the risks," Guilliman replied. "But we cannot base our strategic decisions on outdated intelligence. Recent refugee reports suggest significant fleet movements near the Eye's edge. Horus may be planning something that could affect even Ultramar." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another figure who commanded instant respect from everyone present. Lionel Jonsson entered the strategium with the silent grace that had made the First Legion legendary for their ability to appear where least expected. But like Guilliman, the Lion bore the marks of a century spent fighting a war that could not be won in any conventional sense. His pale features were unmarked by time, but his eyes held depths that spoke of things seen that could not be unseen. The Lord of Caliban wore armor that had been crafted from materials salvaged from a dozen different worlds, each piece bearing the heraldry of populations that had placed their faith in his protection. Some of those symbols represented successful evacuations. Others memorialized worlds that had fallen despite his best efforts. "Brother," the Lion said simply, his voice carrying the weight of old grief and older determination, "I bring news from the Eastern Marches." The Eastern Marches, another euphemism that barely concealed the reality of what Ventress's generation had inherited. Where once the galaxy's eastern spiral arm had contained some of the Imperium's most prosperous worlds, now it was a patchwork of independent human enclaves, orc-held systems, and territories that had fallen to chaos corruption. The Lion had spent the past century carving out a domain in that chaos, protecting what could be protected and destroying what could not be saved. "The situation deteriorates," the Lion continued with characteristic directness. 3 more systems have fallen to the Red Corsairs in the past 6 months. The Orc Empire that calls itself the Iron Skull Confederation has consolidated its hold on the Mordian sector, and I have confirmed reports of Thousand Suns activity in the ruins of Prospero. Each piece of information was another weight added to strategic calculations that grew more complex with each passing year. The human remnants scattered across the galaxy were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the right to exist as something recognizably human in a universe that offered alternatives that were simultaneously seductive and horrifying. "What are our options?" Guilliman asked, though Ventress suspected his gene father already knew the answer. "Limited," the Lion replied. "I can maintain current defensive positions for perhaps another decade with existing resources. After that," he shrugged, the gesture carrying implications that made everyone present uncomfortably aware of their own mortality. "The Eastern Domain has perhaps 3 billion human souls under protection. We save who we can. We hold what we can hold. We prepare the next generation to carry on the fight after we are gone." It was a strategy born of necessity rather than ambition, the acknowledgement that the grand dreams of human unity and galactic conquest had been replaced by the more modest goal of species survival. But it was also a strategy that had worked after a fashion. 100 years after the Emperor's death, humanity still existed as an organized civilization in scattered pockets across the galaxy. They were not the masters of their own destiny that the Great Crusade had promised to make them. But they were not extinct. On Terra, the reality was very different. The world that had given birth to humanity's greatest dreams had become something that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who remembered its golden age. The sprawling hive cities that had once housed billions of loyal imperial citizens were now vast temples dedicated to powers that fed on suffering and transformation. The imperial palace, once the symbol of human achievement, had become a structure that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions where different laws applied. Horus still sat upon the golden throne, though the being that wore his name and memories bore only passing resemblance to the Primarch who had once stood at the Emperor's side. A century of serving as a conduit for the four Chaos gods had transformed him into something that was simultaneously more and less than human. His consciousness existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, coordinating the activities of demon armies that operated according to principles that owed nothing to conventional military doctrine. The traitor legions had evolved beyond recognition. What had once been disciplined space marine formations were now forces that defied easy categorization. Part military unit, part religious congregation, part living experiment in the possibilities of chaos corruption. They waged war not for territory or resources, but for the sheer joy of spreading the influence of their patron gods across populations that still clung to outdated notions of order and stability. But even their successes came with costs that more conventional military commanders would have found unacceptable. The galaxy under Chaos rule was not stable in any meaningful sense. Worlds that embraced corruption found their populations consumed by their own excesses. Industrial capacity that should have supported further expansion was instead diverted toward rituals and ceremonies that served no practical purpose. The very forces that made Chaos armies so effective in battle also made them incapable of building anything that could endure beyond the immediate moment. It was a pattern that repeated itself across the majority of human space. The worlds that had submitted to Horus's rule or fallen to Chaos corruption were stronger in the short term, but weaker in the long term. They could field armies that defied conventional military logic, but they could not maintain the infrastructure necessary to support sustained campaigns across multiple sectors. The scattered remnants of human civilization that maintained their independence were weaker in the short term, but proved remarkably resilient over time. They lacked the raw power to challenge Chaos forces directly, but they possessed something their enemies did not: the ability to plan for futures that extended beyond the immediate satisfaction of divine patrons. Navigator Zerathis, now the matriarch of House Belisarius, after a century of careful succession planning, stood in the navigation chamber of her family's flagship and contemplated charts that told the story of a species learning to adapt to circumstances that should have destroyed them utterly. The absence of the Astronomicon had forced humanity to rediscover navigation techniques that predated the Great Crusade: stellar cartography, psychic beacons maintained by navigator houses working in coordination, and the painstaking process of mapping warp currents that remained relatively stable over short periods. It was slower than what they had enjoyed during the Imperium's height, more dangerous, and far more expensive in terms of human resources. But it worked, after a fashion. The scattered human enclaves maintained contact with each other, shared resources when possible, and coordinated their defenses against threats that any single world could not face alone. Matriarch, her chief astrogator, approached with reports that had become routine over the decades. Confirmation of safe passage for the Ultramar trade convoy, 43 vessels carrying grain, manufactured goods, and 2,000 refugees from the fallen Cadia subsector. Zerathis nodded, making notations on charts that represented years of careful observation and bitter experience. The Cadia subsector had held out for 18 years after the initial Chaos offensive, its population sustained by supply lines that operated despite the absence of centralized imperial authority. But numbers had eventually told, and the evacuation fleets had carried away perhaps 10% of the population that had once called those worlds home. It was a pattern that had played out across the galaxy with depressing regularity. Human worlds would hold out for as long as possible, then execute evacuation plans that saved a fraction of their population, while leaving the remainder to whatever mercy their conquerors chose to offer. The survivors carried with them not just their lives, but the accumulated knowledge and cultural heritage of civilizations that had taken centuries to build. In the archives beneath Ultramar's primary library complex, scholars who had never known the luxury of easy access to information worked to preserve knowledge that represented the efforts of countless generations. Scientific principles that had once been taken for granted were carefully documented and tested to ensure they could be reproduced with limited resources. Literary works that had survived the destruction of their home worlds were copied and distributed to ensure they would not be lost if their current repositories fell. Historical records were maintained not just as academic exercises, but as practical guides for populations that might need to rebuild their civilizations from scratch. It was a massive undertaking that consumed resources that could have been used for military purposes. But Guilliman had made the decision early in Ultramar's independent existence that mere survival was not enough. They had to preserve what made humanity worth preserving in the first place. Chief Librarian Tigurius, now ancient beyond even Space Marine standards, stood in the center of the psychic monitoring station that had become one of Ultramar's most critical defensive installations. The chamber was filled with devices that would have been considered experimental during the Imperium's height: psychic resonance chambers, warp current analyzers, and early warning systems designed to detect the approach of entities that existed beyond normal space-time. But the most important discovery had come not from any technological innovation, but from careful observation of humanity's own evolution over the past century. The species that the Emperor had guided towards psychic awakening was changing, but not in the way he had intended. The mutation rates continue to climb, Tigurius reported to the assembled council of Ultramar's senior leadership. But the nature of those mutations has stabilized. We are not seeing the explosive psychic potential that characterized the early stages of human evolution. Instead, we observe what appears to be limitation, as if some fundamental capacity has been artificially constrained. The implications were staggering. The Emperor's vision for humanity had included the development of psychic abilities that would eventually make the species independent of the warp for interstellar travel and communication. Humans would become beings of pure thought, capable of manipulating reality through will alone while remaining grounded in rationality and moral purpose. Instead, humanity appeared to be evolving toward something far more limited. Psychic abilities were manifesting, but they were restricted in scope and often came with costs that made their use dangerous rather than beneficial. It was as if some force was actively preventing the species from achieving its full potential. The Emperor's sacrifice, Guilliman said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a realization that had been building for years. His death did not simply remove his guidance, it severed the connection between humanity and its intended destiny. The silence that followed carried implications that extended far beyond military strategy or resource allocation. If Tigurius's analysis was correct, then the Emperor's death had not simply set back human development by a few centuries. It had fundamentally altered the trajectory of the species' evolution, locking them into a state where they would remain vulnerable to the very forces they had been destined to transcend. The Chaos Gods had not simply conquered the Imperium, they had stolen humanity's future. But even that revelation carried with it a strange form of hope. If humanity's potential had been artificially constrained, then those constraints might not be permanent. The scattered remnants of human civilization were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the right to eventually become something greater than what they currently were. It would take time, centuries, perhaps millennia. The knowledge necessary to restore humanity's original trajectory might be lost beyond recovery. But the possibility remained, preserved in the genetic legacy of populations that refused to surrender their identity to forces that offered power at the cost of everything that made existence meaningful. In the deep archives of Ultramar, scholars worked to piece together fragments of the Emperor's original vision from sources that had survived the galaxy's transformation. On the frontier worlds, populations adapted to circumstances that would have been unthinkable a century earlier, while maintaining cultural traditions that connected them to humanity's greatest achievements. In the void between stars, navigator houses maintained routes that allowed isolated human enclaves to remember that they were part of something larger than their individual struggles. The galaxy was darker than it had been during the Great Crusade. Humanity was weaker, more divided, more vulnerable to forces that viewed their suffering as entertainment. But they were not extinct, not forgotten, and not without hope. Somewhere in that darkness, carried in the genes of populations that remembered stories of a golden age, the potential for something better than mere survival remained alive. It would take time to nurture that potential into reality. It would require sacrifices that would span generations. It would demand a patience and determination that went against every human instinct for immediate gratification. But it was possible. And as long as it remained possible, the dream that had driven humanity to reach for the stars could not be considered truly dead. In the end, that might be enough. The galaxy burned, but in its burning, new fires were being kindled, smaller than the blazing beacon that had once guided the species toward unity, but no less important for being modest. Each preserved library, each successful evacuation, each child born free of chaos corruption was an act of defiance against forces that wanted nothing more than the complete subjugation of human will. 100 years after the Emperor's death, the war for humanity's soul continued. The outcome remained uncertain. The cost was higher than anyone had imagined, and the participants bore scars that would never fully heal. But it continued, and that, perhaps, was victory enough.